So why don't we call the meeting to order? Please, at any time, help yourself to any of the drinks or those really extra small cookies over there. They could be used as ski. The first item on the agenda. Oh, the first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda and any announcements. I'll do announcements first. And do we need to make any adjustments to the agenda? We have a motion to approve the agenda as written. So moved. Second?
Second.
We have a motion and second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The agenda is approved. What I'd like to do here before we jump into the minutes, if we could just do a quick around the table introductions. So this is the first time we're not in gallery mode. So we can actually see everyone, and we've got other people in the room that we sometimes don't see in our gallery. So I will start. I am John Harris, Chair. I represent the Vermont Retired Educators Association and have been on the board for many years. Dan?
Dan Raddock. I'm the Department of Financial Regulations. Well, I serve at the pleasure of the Commissioner of the Department of Financial Regulation. Many years, but not nearly as many as John. So not nearly as many as you, John. Feels like many years, yeah. But yeah, I wonder how long it's been.
Yeah.
I'm Perry Lessing. I'm here as an alternate to John. I'm a retired teacher, and I'm appointed here by the VREA, the Vermont Retired Educators Association. And I'm also VPIC, VSTRS representative to VPIC. So I have both of those things going on. I've been doing it seems like a long time also, but not as long as Dan, and nowhere near as long as John.
Tim Duggan, I'm Director of the Vermont Retirement Systems.
Gavin Boyles, Deputy Treasurer, here on behalf of Treasurer Pichak, and only been on the board for 2.5 years.
I'm Matt Strom, one of the actuaries on the Siegel team.
Genevieve Hamby, also said Genevieve Hamby. I'm the alternate VSTRS board member and teacher of math at North Country Union High School.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Love math.
Erin Carter, I'm also a math teacher, just so that we can be cool together. At Spalding High School down the road in Barry, vice chair, active teacher rep. I think I started in 2020, so I've never gotten to do it in person.
Yeah.
Good to see you folks. I'm Colin Robinson. I work at Vermont NEA. We're the union that represents public school educators, teachers, and support staff. So good to see big faces.
Brianna Howard. I am a retirement specialist with division. Also manage your physical retirement.
Bill Meckel. I'm the secretary for your board.
Scott Baker. I'm Director of Financial Reporting in the Treasurer's Office.
I am Jeremiah Brewer. I'm the CFO of the Treasurer. Justin St. James, General Counsel of the Treasurer's Office.
Rob Luciani with Empower.
Good afternoon, Gabe DeLeese with Empower.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda, as I just inappropriately took a bite of my cookie. Approval of the minutes of April 2025 meeting. Do we have a motion? So moved. Second. Any discussion on the minutes? All those in favor of approving the minutes of April 2025 meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The minutes passed. We'll open the floor now for any public comment. I have no public comment, so we will close that. And the next item on the agenda is the Siegel Actuarial Risk Assessment.
I might just briefly kick this off. Very happy to have Matt Strom here from Siegel to present the actuarial risk assessment. By way of background, some of you may recall that back in 2019, we did our first actuarial risk assessment. And so it is a study based on actuarial standards that looks at sort of what will happen to our progress towards full funding if certain inputs, be they demographic or financial. So Matt will present both the stochastic look at that question and a deterministic look at that question based on some of the scenarios that we talked about, I guess, a few months ago as board. I think this study is a really fascinating study. It will end in a look at a couple different funding policy options. I wanted to stress that, this is the very start of a conversation, and I think we will be having it over an extended period of time. Goal for today is not to make any decisions, but really to build vocabulary. What happens to a closed funding policy as you approach the endpoint, and what considerations do we want to have in mind as we get closer to 2038? So I fully expect that we're going to have additional conversations at the board level. This is a tool that's going to help us kind of build that initial vocabulary, understand how we might think about it, and and we can go from there. The intent, just from a little housekeeping perspective, is to have Matt do the first half of the meeting, and then we'll take a quick break, stretch our legs, and then we'll bring it home with the other items.
Thank you.
Very good. Then I'll take it from here. I've got this shared up on the screen, and this is a 62-page document, which is a good read. We're not going to go through all the slides. We're going to look at sort of the most of the graphics, but there is some narrative in here that really makes this an entire report for someone to be able to pick it up and, like 2 years from now and look back and see, well, what was the purpose of this and what did they do? I'm going to pass over quite a bit of this narrative and go to, there's a point on this slide that I'll just make, is that we are talking about dollars when they're projected, just so it's $1 in that day. So when we're talking about a contribution in 2038, there's a table in here somewhere where you can multiply that by an inflation factor to kind of bring it back to think about today's dollars. That's one thing. And then the other thing is again, Tim, you really hit this, is that you'll see some scenarios in here that are diabolical, as you get in 2037 as to what the contribution might be. And so it's awareness as to how the current policy works, but also again, looking at just some very simple alternatives to the current policy and what could be done to smooth out the contribution requirements with other funding policies. So we did want to start with a background. So, we're certainly a lot of forward-looking information, but we want to look at where we are now. So this graphic here is the funded ratio on a market value basis. It started just over 60% back in 2010, and in 2024, it is also, lo and behold, just over 60%. So it's moved around quite a bit, mostly down, but it's had some, pretty large swings. One of the things we do with the actuarial funding is we calculate an actuarial value of assets, which smooths out a lot of that volatility. And you can see this shows a really good visual example of why we do that. We don't see these, the peaks and valleys nearly as much with the smooth value of assets. But again, it's in fact, with last year's valuation, the funded metric on both values of assets was almost identical. It was very, very similar. So it's kind of been declining, but then since 2020, particularly with some plan changes, but also the supplemental contributions, has really helped bring the funded ratio up. We thought it would also be interesting to layer on the universe of other statewide public sector teacher plans. And the story is not dissimilar, kind of starting around, comparing apples to apples, starting nearly in the same spot and just really struggling to make a lot of major progress. In fact, the rate of increase in your plan has actually exceeded the rate of increase over the last several years in the broader universe. So not dissimilar for sure.
It's interesting. I think those two little dips down represent pretty much where we changed the assumed investment return.
Yeah,
so you don't kind of see
like
that.
here and then here were the two, and we'll see that I think on maybe this slide. Yeah. So another, again, how did we get here? Again, Patrick's here. Good. Come on in. He's another one of our actuaries. So we expect we have a liability every year, and we have, minus taking the assets from that, you have unfunded liability. And we expect that to grow each year or to change, at least change each year, because people are earning benefits are being paid, we're losing a year of interest discounting. So we do expect it to change, and all that's built into our assumptions. But then each year when we do the next valuation, stuff happens that we didn't expect. It wasn't part of the assumptions. And so that changes the unfunded liability in ways that we don't know. And so going back to 2011, this shows just a year-by-year look at the sources of unfunded liability. You can see the zero line here. Things above the zero line are unexpected losses, and things below the zero are unexpected gains. And ideally, you'd like to see, this running right in the middle, and sometimes you have gains, sometimes you have losses, recognizing you're never going to be perfect. But this is not unheard of to have mostly losses out there. And I always think that the biggest culprit, the easiest thing to do is to blame the investment experience. But when you look at the investment experience, it's actually been on both sides of the ledger, and it's actually been pretty small. This is using the smooth value of assets. So a lot of that smoothing is happening before it's being reflected in the unfunded, if that makes sense. So that's one of the reasons you really, with asset smoothing and then recognizing it here, you kind of get a separate, two ways to smooth out your investment experience. Non-investment experience is all the other demographic experience that happens the way you don't expect it to. So, for example, retirees living longer than expected, that would generate a positive number, or more unfunded than you expect. Retirees living shorter than expected would be on the other side. Salary increases more than expected, retirements earlier than you expect. Those are the types of things that create additional unfunded liability. More terminations than expected is a gain that would show up on the bottom side. But I think what's interesting is that you'd like to see your assumptions be that you have some teal on both sides of the zero, but it kind of works out that it's always, they're not large in magnitude, but they always tend to be losses. So that's part of the true-up process that we do with the actuarial assumptions with the experience study every 3 years. Back pre-2015, there were OPREB-related expenses that were coming out of the trust. So those were not really funded for, they weren't really recognized. So when they occurred, they were effectively increases in unfunded liability as that money was coming out. More recently, we put an admin expense assumption in there. And so as part of the normal cost contribution, we're adding in an expected admin expense assumption. And then to the extent that the actual admin is different, it creates a really small gain or loss. You can barely see it coming on here in 22 through 24 because it's such a small amount. So I mentioned the non-invested experience and the investment experience. Those are all based on what our assumptions are. But again, when we true those up, we do do an experience study, we change assumptions, and that creates a one-time source of unfunded liability. Most of the time, especially here, most of the time it's been positive and fairly significant, and a lot of that has to do with the investment return assumption. So back in the day, there was the select and ultimate discount rate assumption, which started out at a rate, let's say was 8.5%, and then the first year's benefit payments will be discounted at 8.5%. The next year's at 8.25%. The next year's at 8%, and so forth, until you came out to an ultimate rate. And then in the following year, the way that the original valuation worked would say, okay, well then year 2, that first payment should be discounted at 8.25%, but it always was resetting back to 8.5% or whatever the numbers were at the time. So it was always behaving like an assumption change. So that's why there was all these increases in unfunded liability, because it was basically resetting a select and ultimate mechanism. In 2017, there was a change from a 7.95% discount rate down to 7.5%, along with another package. So the net value there was a pretty large increase. And you can see a couple years later, there was another large increase. Going from 7.5% down to 7% is another pretty big change in the discount rate assumption. Most recently, with the 2023 experience study, we updated the mortality improvement scale, which actually dialed back expected improvement. So that was actually a decrease in liability So we do see a couple, we see a couple times here assumption changes on the bottom side of the ledger, but mostly it's these large increases. Act 114, Act 173 had some changes that decreased liability, so that's shown on there too. And then additional contributions. So we calculate an amount, and then to the extent that more money goes in than the required contribution, that shows up on the negative side of this equation. And most recently, the large supplemental state contributions. There was one from 2022, and then last year's amount helps bring down the unfunded liability. And this page here squeezes that all together, so you can think about the different sources. Really, the two biggest ones were the experience from the non-investment assumptions, things like salary increases, retirements, mortality, and then changing the assumption. So once that adverse experience was occurring, then changing the assumptions to kind of mitigate those losses in the future, but basically bringing it all back into the current liabilities. Those are the two biggest. That's the gold and the teal here are the two largest sources of unfunded liability. And then on the bottom is the plan provisions and the supplemental contributions. And then this blue in here is really dates back to those OPEB expenses from early on in that projection. This page is some supplemental metrics that come out of, Perry, you shared this, I think, with us, that you had read this, NCPERS, the National Coalition on Public Employee Retirement Systems. And they said, everyone's really used to looking at the very common metric of funded percentage to evaluate the health of the plan. But this was kind of a think tank of, financial people. There was a couple actuaries on there. And so what are some other ways to think about metrics that might be useful, and also in addition to the funded ratio, but in addition to evaluate the health of a plan, not only currently, but looking forward. And there were three things. The two that we picked to look at here, the first one is called USP. It's the UAL stabilization payment. So this is an amount that is converted to a percentage of covered payroll for the system. And it says what would be the amount in each year such that the unfunded liability at the end of the year would be the same, would have no change from the beginning of the year. So oftentimes actuaries will call this like the treadwater amount. So you're not taking away any unfunded liability, but you're not adding any unfunded liability to that. And so, it was back in 2010, it looked like it was about 12.5% had increased. With the discount rate change, I think probably this in a market downturn had jumped up to over 25%, but it's been coming down recently. We thought for comparison purposes to take the actual contributions made each year and layer that on, and you can see it was lower than this amount for quite a while, caught up in 2018, and then certainly with the 2022 supplemental payment far exceeded. So it really put a dent in the unfunded liability, that supplemental payment from 2022. So all told, that was over a 45% of pay contribution back from 2022. The other metric that was interesting from the paper is, again, looking at the total liability of the plan, the unfunded liability of the plan, but compared to the resources necessary to actually finance the plan. And do you have a liability that's a really big portion of whatever this financing mechanism, or is it manageable? And so they discussed, it's called the scaled liability, and they discussed several sources of basically this denominator. The one that they settled on that was reasonably good to use, and it was pretty easy to find, was it's a published number from the Treasury called the total taxable resources. So we look at each state. So for Vermont has a published amount of total taxable resources, and then for each year it says, so it's like that's for 1 year, but you're trying to look at your liability is being paid out over a very long period of time. So project out the total taxable resources in each year over a 30-year period. So it's coming up with a fairly large denominator to divide these out. So the total liability divided by this measure ends up being about 20 basis points currently, was over 15 basis points, but it's about 20 basis points. I think from the standpoint of, look, comparing this to a state plan where it has maybe both teachers and state employees included in it, you'd maybe want to think about this in connection with the state employees plan, which is not dissimilar from this measure. And from a total liability standpoint, I think the ones that they were comparing to, there was one, I think, that was like, the total was like 75 basis points for all the state employees. And they were like, yeah, that one's not, that's reasonable. That's not terrible. So when I look at this and think, okay, what's probably like, 35 or 40 basis points, I get the same kind of that same feeling. The one to really compare it to is, though, you have assets to cover this. So you really are looking at unfunded liability. The total one is for if something were to happen with the assets and there was a huge market downturn, are you now stuck with the promise that as a percentage of your economy is too big? But knowing that you had these assets and they're funded and you don't expect that to happen, you can really start focusing on this unfunded metric. And you want to see this number, not increasing too much. It's actually been coming down. So I think, I think this is indicative of a manageable liability relative to the economy. I don't know what your takeaway was, Perry, when you read this.
I think it's very encouraging.
Yeah.
To see that given the size of the economy and what we're really paying out of, what we can afford and what it's costing to pay for our pensions, it just doesn't seem like it's 1/5 of 1%.
Yeah, I think if you remember,
not
one of the ones that they compared to was New Jersey, which typically it does have problems. They do have funding problems, but their numbers weren't. It wasn't like their numbers were 50% of the economy. It was like 75. I think their unfunded was maybe like 25 or 50, and their funded was like 75 basis points.
I think it's very helpful to have this larger context of like what are our pension costs relative to the full economy.
Mm-hmm.
I think in part too, these are kind of newer metrics, and I'm not quite sure how folks are going to view these as these develop. What I really like about having them here is to start tracking them so that as a historical tool, we have other ways to think about our funding path. And so this was a great ad, Barry, and I think it helped as we presented it to all the boards.
Yeah, I want to thank both of you for for including it. It's a big step forward.
Very interesting stuff. There's a little bit more narrative here about the risks. I think we've talked about these, being investment, the volatility on the demographic side, things we have predictions of what happens, but then there are things that happen that we just weren't accounted for, and how does that impact numbers? We've talked about this. Next section focuses on really the difference between deterministic and stochastic modeling. I think it's easy to view it from looking at these graphics, where the top line here is a deterministic projection. It's this one would say, if you earned your expected return, or I don't know what this could be anything. This is just an example, but if something happened, here's the result. And it's just a straight line. The bottom one is where you're taking, several different investment scenarios that are modeled and then running those through a projection of contributions, or in this case, funded percentage, and coming out with a variety of results. So you can see that the most of the time, the numbers are, kind of congregating around a baseline amount, but that there are times where you do see scenarios where, in this case, the funded percentage is really high in this light green, and there's a light green at the bottom where it's really low. And so it's interesting to see what those numbers are and how often that they actually happen. So you can know is it likely to happen, or is it unlikely to happen. So we kind of take each of these years and break those down into percentiles. So we've got a gray bar in the middle that would, and our charts going forward, or at least the stochastic ones, have, we show the 50th percentile, we show the second and third quartiles around that, which is, representing basically 50% of simulations around the 50th percentile number. So 50% of outcomes are there, and then we're layering on two more, not necessarily quartiles, but 20% of outcomes above the 75th, so 75th to 95th, and then the lower 20% that go from the 25th down to the 5th percentile. So when we look at our bands, all the outcomes, 90% of all outcomes fall within this range, and then there's 5% either above it or 5% below it. We did end up using to model, the baseline stuff is all at 7%, which is the assumption. We modeled the stochastic using composite capital market assumptions from a survey of 26 investment consulting firms. We did know, REK is included in there. We just didn't want to go with just one entity to do this. We wanted to look at a broader population so as not to have, a more aggressive or more conservative view from the pack. But it really doesn't matter exactly what set of assumptions you're using. It's really trying to look directionally. So if we were to use a set of assumptions that were more conservative with lower returns, we would have the same type of ranges of outcomes. They would just be lower, or higher contributions, lower funded percentage, things like that. And this is just to show that based on the Horizon study, the 2024 capital market assumptions, loading them in with the VPIC target portfolio, that the 50th percentile return is 7.31%, which compared to the 7%, it's about a 54% chance of meeting or exceeding the 7% assumption. And I like this histogram at the bottom, which just shows 1 year of annual returns, of the 5,000 trials and where they fall, because as you would expect, most of the outcomes, most of the returns are between like this -1 and maybe 16% range. And it's what you would think of typically is looking back at historical portfolio returns. They're usually in that range, but that we are including things in our projection that happen they do happen, but they're not likely. But returns over 30%, returns below negative 15% are in the model because they are potentially possible mathematically, but we just don't see them a lot in nature.
Matt, can I ask a very basic question?
Sure.
So when we were looking at like the unfunded liability calculation before your presentation started, well, it was part of maybe it was Tim's portion, or maybe it was I forget whose.
Okay.
But as we changed the assumptions on stock market returns from 8% to 7.5 to 7, we saw big jumps in, the sort of that UAL, if that's the right word.
Right.
And then I thought I just heard you say it doesn't really matter what assumptions we use, where we just saw. So I guess I'm getting stuck on a word you used, and I'm just trying to square the 2 points. In some ways, it really does matter what is like the assumptions return, but for the purpose of the stochastic modeling, you're saying it doesn't matter so much because
it totally matters what the inputs are, but just from viewing this as a standpoint of like one of the main takeaways is going to be volatility as we approach 2038. Is going to show. The current funding policy says pay for this over 2 years, 1 year, and it shows a really large, under some situations, a very large contribution due for that year, the year before the 2038 fiscal year. And so my point is that volatility happens no matter you're using RVK or if you're using, that messaging is there kind of no matter what the assumptions are.
Okay.
But it does matter.
You can pick consultant B, you can pick consultant C. At the end story, there is going to be a range.
Right.
And I think it's different assumptions. The initial slide was talking about our investment return assumption. The capital market assumptions are inputs into that. They're what all of the different advisors think, different asset classes, how they'll perform over the long run. So that's where you have, a big range. RVK may be a little conservative, others may be more aggressive. So I think to Matt's point, those don't matter as much as long as we're kind of trying to pick in the middle. Whereas our investment return assumption is very key. Right. So I think it's just different assumptions.
Yeah. If we were trying to predict what the contribution amount would be in 2030, 2035, 2038 and kind of plan for that now, it would really matter which assumptions we picked. But for purpose of this is just kind of seeing the volatility around that, of investments and how that really interacts with the funding period and just the expected range of contributions. I guess my point was that it matters a little bit less for that, which specific capital market assumptions you use, because the message, the broad message is the same.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt your flow on that.
No problem.
I think it is worth noticing, this is more from a few slides ago, but that we get these huge changes in the unfunded liability calculation by changing the assumed rate of return when we went from 7.9 something to 7.5 to 7.0. But the actual returns from the actual portfolio, when we look at what the markets have really given back to us, have been really pretty well done there. They've pretty well pulled their weight.
Yeah.
So the actual market returns have not really increased the unfunded liability, but our assumptions about them have increased the unfunded liability.
Yeah, and it's really
to keep in mind.
It's forward-looking. Those are based on forward-looking expectations, and so you've just done a pretty good job. What that means is you've done a pretty good job of staying in front of the wave, if you will. So you haven't sat with a bad assumption, a bad investment return assumption for a long time, experienced large losses, and so well, now it's time to move. You've said like, well, the expectations going forward, we did okay last year, but going forward, things aren't, the expectations are lower. So you're kind of in front of the curve and not necessarily behind it. That's kind of the takeaway I have from that. This is just now the first of the stochastic, really looking at the simulated geometric returns. So what happens here is in 1 year, the range of outcomes is very large. And in fact, this is basically the other graph, but kind of looking on top of it. It ranges from -11.5% to 27%. But then when you have another set like this in the next year, when you compound those two and take the average, it trends downward over time. So in other words, if this were to be, if you had two 27% returns, the chances of that happening is a 5% and then another 5%, which is really like a 2.5% chance of that happening in back-to-back years. So actually, the 97.5th percentile is probably up here in 27. That's how it starts to kind of converge down over time. That's the way I think about it. But the real point is that, by the time you get out 20 years, you have 7.3% as your median, but the range of between the 25th and 50th percentile is pretty. I mean, it's small, but it is pretty large. I mean, it's 5.5 to 9.1%. So there's a 50% of outcomes will fall with a geometric 20-year return between 5.5 and 9.1%. This is that table that I talked about and how we can kind of view future dollars and bring them back to the current. We do have one exhibit where we show that a couple times. And then one other thing to mention is that for this purpose, when unfunded liability is paid off and perhaps even investment returns are generating a surplus position, we're still modeling that the contribution in a given year is at least normal cost. So I think when we did this 5 years ago, we limited it to zero. But here we're saying, we're interpreting the funding policy to be, you're just going to pay normal cost, and anything that's above that will go into surplus and kind of grow for a rainy day, to offset future adverse experience.
I think I'll just jump off to make a point that that's one circumstance. There are others when we start talking about the funded policy where, we kind of have to make an assumption to be able to illustrate different outcomes or scenarios to folks. A lot, what we do after 2038 in some ways is we don't know. And that's for us to think about. So what I wanted to stress is that there's, when you see some of these, we'll have different alternatives to look at for the funded policy, what we do after 2038, all of these things, we made some decisions to have a coherent deck, but these are going to be discussion points as we go forward.
So now we're into the actual forward-looking deterministic models. These are pretty much the assumptions, scenarios that we discussed. So we ran a baseline. What happens if you under or overperform by 1% every single year? What happens if there's 1 year of shock? So the current year we're in now, fiscal 25, if it's 14 below, 7 below the assumption, 7 above the assumption, or 14 above the assumption. And then we looked at into the trials, the stochastically modeled trials, the 500 simulations, and we looked for scenarios that averaged 7%. So we know we saw in the other one there was a range of of geometric returns, but there were certainly some that came out to 7%. And we looked for scenarios that would be interesting to evaluate on a deterministic basis.
And that's the one we talked about, the different deterministic scenarios we wanted to look at, and really kind of came up with the symmetrical point. We wanted to look at things both positive and negative to make sure we're not determining outcome. This is the one additional one, and because I think it's really interesting and eye-opening, because it kind of looks at everything that gets to 7. So we're right at the baseline at this, but it's all about timing when we're hitting the different returns. And so this was this was one that came up in the middle of doing the report, but I think it's one of the most interesting ones as we looked at that.
Yeah, it should have found its way into the original draft, just because it's very common to look at the different timing of cash flows, but in all these assumptions where you're getting to 7%, just how much. I mean, I think we'll see that the big message is the sooner you can get the money in and have it start earning good returns is what really helps the contributions come down and helps the funded ratio. We did 2 on the demographic side. One was looking at changes in increases or decreases in headcount, the impact on that. And then again, on the demographic side, life expectancy is usually one of the bigger, more impactful assumptions. So we looked at the impact of like a one-time, things all of a sudden we wake up tomorrow and everyone's healthier, or there's treatment for cancer or whatever. And so we looked at as if we applied a 2-year age setback to the mortality. So a 70-year-old in this evaluation, we'd be valuing them as if they're 68 years old. And then we also looked at a short-term decline. So this would be more like another, pandemic-like event. So we know we experienced excess mortality before. If that were to happen again, and we valued that by looking at for a 4-year period, everyone is behaving like their mortality is as if they're 5 years older for that 4-year period of time, and then it drops back down to what the current levels are. So just to kind of level set on the baseline projection, this is showing what the calculated required contributions are in the projection each year. And we know that from Act 114, the state is also paying a $15 million supplemental payment until the fund hits 90%. So that looks like this on top. What we show throughout the report, when we talk about the contributions, we're talking about the sum of these 2 amounts. So this dark gray line is what we're going to see a lot throughout this report. But just to not lose sight of when the supplemental payments are included, in all the data tables, when it's included, up to the point through it's included is highlighted in a light purple. So it'll kind of denote. You'll be able to see usually a drop off in the number, but it'll be denoted when the supplemental payment is made by these purple boxes. Oh, and then this is also just talking about that, the $264 million projected contribution in 2035. In today's dollars, in 2025 dollars, we discount back, it's worth about $210 million. So in fact, with these supplemental contributions, with the funding progress of the system, in nominal dollars, it's getting more expensive, but in today's dollars, which kind of makes sense, the plan's actually getting cheaper over time as the liability is projected to be paid off, and it's going to trend towards a contribution that's closer to normal cost. And this is a projection of the funded percentage. And as uninteresting and uninspiring as it looks, the fact that it is a straight line and not something that's concave I think is a good takeaway. So you're kind of on a path marching straight towards 100% funded under the current policy. There are ways and funding policies that would backload contributions, and so you'd see stalled progress in the interim, in the early years, and then it would swoop up towards the end, which would mean that there's some backloading going on, and all the aggressive funding is done at the end. But yours is really ratably happening over the entire period.
Our current policy, if you looked at this a few years ago, about 10 years ago, with a 5% increase and without the supplemental payments, I would think it would be more like have a little bit more swoop to it. So this is indicative of a lot of the work that's going on.
But we still have some, right? Don't we have a 3% increase?
Yeah.
The idea that the supplemental is taking the 15 million in supplemental. Why isn't that 3% showing up as a little bit of a little bit of a curve there? Or is it just sort of imperceptible?
It's kind of imperceptible, and the normal cost also is increasing, usually right around that same value. So it feels like it's level progress from, at least as a percentage of payroll, everything's kind of linked up. So it's all kind of level. Back with the 5% increases, you had your normal cost that was increasing roughly with payroll at, let's say payroll growth is 3%, but your amortizations being at 5% increases were lower amortizations at the beginning and then higher at the end. So it would show more of a slope, but I would say it's more just kind of imperceptible.
And with supplemental payments offsetting it, of course, because any backloading the 3% does, you're front loading with
Let's bring it back down.
Yeah.
Great. Let's keep.
Here's the baseline with our first +1, -1, and I think we'll look at getting 6% per year every single year. We'll look at that one first. And so because so this is now every single year you have a 1% loss on investments, which first goes through the smoothing process on the actuarial value of assets. So that's happening at first. And so that's why you see not a lot of difference for like the first 4 or 5 years, is because it's not a big difference, and it's also being smoothed. But it's building up additional unfunded liability, and the amount of time to actually pay for that is shrinking until you get to out here to 2038. So what would be, what's this $265 million contribution in the baseline is $408 million. And then each year thereafter, there's still losses that are being generated each year and expected to get paid off in a single year. That's as opposed to if you were to beat the assumption by 1% every year, you would actually have the contribution. You'd get 100% faster, get to 100% faster here looks like by it's around the same time. You actually get to 90% faster, and then the supplemental shuts off a year sooner, but the contribution amount drops down to the normal cost value here. Here's the funded percentage. So we've got 2 graphs for each scenario. There's not a lot of difference in this because it's really the contributions that are the ones that are chasing to get to 100% funded. So you don't see a lot of volatility or a lot of disparity in the projected funded percentage, because that's all happening on the contribution side to try to either slow down, the path to 100% funded if you're over exceeding the return, or accelerate it if you're undershooting the 7%. And then this is what things look like with the different shocks. So I'll go on the good news first. The 21%. So this year, 21% return, 7% thereafter would kind of drop the contribution in each year. If you had one bad year this year, a -7 goes in the other direction. These scenarios are not terribly different than the always 6 or always 8%, but there's some symmetry between getting 15 or 16, 18 years of 1%, but then here getting one shot of a 14% gain or loss. It's roughly equivalent on a present value basis. So it wasn't too surprising that these looked about the same. They have about the same impact. And then the 0% kind of floats in the middle there, and the 14% is also right in the middle. But this actually could kind of help you based on if we ever figure out where things are going to shake out for fiscal 25, this could probably give you an idea of what at least next year's projected contribution could look like. And then this is pretty much the same concept, although you do have a little bit more disparity because the large gain or loss is happening right away and then being reflected over time. So these all kind of lump in there like that. So now these are those scenarios with the volatility, and the top graphic is the annual, like year by year returns that were experienced. The bottom graph, as well as the table on the bottom, is the compound geometric return over time. So the first year they're the same, and then in year 2, the 2025 is showing, I'll show you the baseline. This is 7%. This one's pretty easy. You get 7% year 1, 7% year 2. Your compounded is always 7%. So this one always is 7% every year. But we found a scenario that was a longer market downturn. So it's like an extended downturn, and it happens at a time when you're approaching the 2038 bogey. In fact, it's a little bit before then, because with asset smoothing, it's really bringing in a lot of this downturn even before, not letting it push out past the 2038. So you can see it's, kind of some good returns. And then right around here by 2032, you're looking at like a 0, a -10, a 3% return. So you've got kind of these 4 years in here that show, if you look at it on the table, through 2030, it's a 9.8% compound return. Then once these start happening, it actually drops below 7% for a while until there's some really good returns coming out of that downturn, such that it was at 7%. So this is the kind of scenario that I think is reasonable. It would probably cause the most heartache for the current funding policy. The next one is a more quicker, abrupt downturn, and it happens a little bit sooner. So it's here in 2030 and 2031. And these are kind of like the one, this reminds me of some downturns that we've seen in recent memory in the last 20 years, where you have just 2 years of really bad returns, but then some recovery after that. This one here is called good early, bad late. It's basically through the first 10 years, really strong returns. So it's returned 11% geometric average through the first half. And then it does poorly enough in the second half such that it winds up at 7%. And the other one's the opposite. So it starts out pretty bad through 2033, the first 10 years, 5.3%, but then it does well on the back half to come back to 7%. And then the last one, which I think is sort of interesting for a particular reason that you'll see on the graphics, is this a very highly volatile year-to-year scenario where you have significantly high returns and significantly low returns, but they're kind of bouncing around year to year. And you can already tell, looking at the geometric return, that once you get to about past 2030, it's really pretty close to the 7% expected return. And again, this is smooth, the geometric average and on the year by year, it's doing a good job of at least coming back to this always being 7%. Okay. So now we have a little bit of a different scale here, but this baseline is the one we've seen before. And so looking at the contributions under that extended market downturn, remember, it was doing pretty well. And then right at the end, it had those 4 years of bad returns. So Rookwood looks like it'll be a projected $600 million contribution in 2038. And then even still a few large contributions extending out after that, where it's whatever the residual amount is, it's being paid, that's coming in from those losses. They're being reflected in the actuarial value of assets, and then they're being expected to get paid off over 1 year. So that's these two contributions before it settles in to just the normal cost payment. The one where the downturn happens before then, so a little bit more time to react to it, the contributions are higher earlier, but they don't jump up quite as high. So they're kind of capping out at $374 million. Take those two off. good early, bad late. So this one drops down to normal cost. So it hits 100% funded a few years earlier and then settles in when it's building up surplus at this time. But according to the current funding policy, when when these investment losses happen and they're being reflected in the actuarial smoothing value, then it has to get paid out over 1 year period. So these contributions out here past 2041 are saying whatever losses are being brought in, those have to get funded over a 1 year period of time. And then bad early, but good late, has the contributions, obviously going up into the $350 million, $360 million range, but then dropping down once that money comes in. It's now it's coming in and then it's earning the really good returns. So this actually hits 100% funded, or gets pretty close a year in advance.
I'm not sure I'm understanding.
Yeah.
The good early, bad late seems to be the only one. Are the bad returns after 2038 in that one?
But yes.
Okay.
Yeah, probably starting in 20 here. Well, they were starting in 2034, which affects the 2036 contribution, but they're being smoothed in.
Okay.
So the first kind of bad return is being smoothed in over 5 years. And so it's really not finding its way in until probably 2038, 940.
Got it. And then just one other question in the chart at the bottom, the purple shading indicates years in which the supplemental payment.
Yes, okay. Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, on some of these, like good, bad, well, the one we're looking at now,
right.
Supplemental shuts off and then bad returns come. And it's like, well, we could have used that.
Yeah, right. Right.
This one's sort of interesting, the high volatility, because even though it's highly volatile, the whole process of the actuarial smoothing is working as intended. It's intended to take out the heartache of year-to-year volatility and smooth it in. So, but for the 1 year where it's a loss coming in and you have 1 year to pay for it, otherwise it tracks pretty closely to the baseline. So I think that kind of demonstrates that at least, the mechanism that's in there to smooth out volatility in investments, even in a highly volatile year-to-year situation, it's doing its job pretty well. Then looking at the funded percentage, this will be helpful too when we start looking at the alternatives, but none of these are what you wouldn't expect. This one did well, and then it gets punished with those bad returns when the Dow chart comes in, but ultimately ends up over 100% funded. This earlier downturn, again, it's not terribly, and by design, it's not supposed to go too far away from the baseline, because that all happens because of the way the contributions are determined. This one ends up over 100.
The fascinating thing about those two is that, for the near term, they actually look pretty good, because the funded percentage is tracking above what our expectation is. Just pointing, but they're the ones that, because the volatility happens right before the 2038, they're the ones that result in that really difficult spike. So I think these two charts kind of illustrate well a signal we might be seeing is, all right, things are good. But, that's the sort of issue with the 2038 period, a date certain.
Yeah, you have to hold your breath once you get there.
Yeah.
You just don't know what's going to happen. This one was the good returns. The contributions go down, but it's hitting 100%. But it still manages building up this surplus a little bit. So by the time the bad returns come, it's still hanging in there pretty well. And then this one, I said, okay, the money has to come in. These are the higher contributions early because the returns aren't that good. But then once that comes in and once that money's there to actually earn return, this one actually does the best in 20 years because that money's there and then it's earning those good returns late in the 20-year period. And then again, not surprisingly, the high volatility one tracks pretty close to the baseline, which I think is kind of find to be interesting. So this is looking at on the demographic side and the change in membership. So here's the baseline contribution. I did turn these into a percentage of pay, if you want to think about it in terms of pay, that this 265 million divided by projected payroll is roughly a 23% of pay. So looking at an increase in headcount of basically 10%, that would take the 10,500 actives in 2024 up to almost 11,700 in 5 years. It doesn't have a major impact on the contributions because most of the contribution is going to pay for legacy unfunded liability. And these new people are not generating that much unfunded liability. So it's, it's getting marginally more expensive because of their normal cost, but they haven't really contributed any unfunded liability. And in fact, as a percentage of pay, they've made the plan cheaper because you have more payroll base, but you haven't increased the contribution very much. So it's actually slightly cheaper as a percentage of overall payroll. And the converse is true, obviously, with the decrease in headcount. Again, most of this is, normal cost payments decreasing. It's actually more expensive because we've got fewer people. That's 24% of pay. But these headcounts are not terribly unreasonable looking back over the last 10 years to be at really either one of these two places within a 5 to 10 year period. And just to point out, the way we did this is we didn't target, any demographic and to shrink the population, for example. The current 10,500 members we're expected to lose 500 or 600 of those people either to retirement or terminating. And so our baseline model says, let's say we lose all 567, to go from 10,500 to 10,000. Our baseline model brings in 567 new people to keep the population level. So what we've done is basically said, let's just not bring in as many new people on the decrease, or let's bring in slightly more new people to increase the head count. So I think we were talking before, it's a different animal if you're saying, oh, this group of people, or we're going to have a bunch of a reduction in workforce that's going to manipulate the workforce, and we're going to lose people of a certain demographic to retiring early or incentivizing them to retire. That obviously has a different impact on this projection. This is really just more or less backfilling the population to track these increases or decreases. A very uninspiring chart here. You can't even see the numbers coming in, but they're there. No change in the projected funded ratio. It's just all handled on the contribution side. For mortality, so here's our baseline projection, and then the situation where we have, pretty much overnight a better, better mortality, people living longer. This, again, with what we modeled, the exposure here looks like, was this like out in 2033, 260. So it's about $30 million of exposure of contribution. If the magic wand was people are living basically 2 years longer than what you expected, that you can say that's probably worth $25 to $30 million in contribution. That directly hits unfunded liability when people are living longer. I mean, in reality, we wouldn't make any changes. If this were a gradual, we wouldn't make any changes, but if it were something that we happen, we would make an adjustment. We probably would do something like, let's do a setback on the mortality, something very similar, until we got to a point where we had actual data and then could make adjustments to a mortality table, or they probably would come up with new tables to reflect this. And then the worst is this is just a temporary thing. So the 4 years of worse mortality, and this shows that the contribution stays level for several years, and then it has some nominal increases before it jumps down.
And over the years, we have been changing the mortality rate and pushing the age up.
Yeah,
We've done that at least 3 times in recent memory.
And those changes usually are things like people are living 3 or 4 months longer than expected. Okay. So you could think of it in terms of people are living 2 years longer. That's a much bigger deal.
Favor of that, but
I think me too.
In general.
In general.
It's not so good for the plan, but it sure is a lot of fun to.
I understand.
And then this is a pretty similar look. The one where things get better. the funded ratio drags a little bit, but eventually they all catch up. So that's it on the deterministic for now. On the stochastic modeling, we have now our baseline projection. We have a different scale on the y-axis, so this is going to appear that it's down. It's kind of foreshadowing, how bad the 95th percentile could be that we're showing $1.2 billion on here. But our 50th percentile numbers coming in, because the stochastic projections assume that on average, if you will, it's a 7.3% return. The baseline's 7, so it actually brings down the projected contributions a little bit relative to the baseline. But here's the range: the 50% of outcomes fall within this range. The second quartile and the third quartile. So we're looking at 25% of the time contributions going to normal cost 3 years early, and 25% of the time contributions up in this $400 to $500 million range. So it's quite a big range out there. And then if you go to the other percentiles, to get that full 90% range, it goes pretty high. It's over $1 billion. In fact, here's the 95th percentile. And again, this is where, as it gets closer, these bad scenarios, which don't happen really often, but they're out there with 5% probability, are expected to be paid off over a 1-year period. This one's not too exciting, is the projected funded ratio, but what it does demonstrate is that there's more upside potential the way we've modeled it, where we're building up surplus with overfunded positions. But on the downside, it's really limited, because what happens on the downside is that the gold here, the gold and dark blue here, are the teal and effectively the teal and the light tan on the other side, because we have higher contributions on the other side, which is really what's offsetting the fact that we're not able to have the funded ratio by design go that low here. Okay, so now we can get back into the funding policy analysis. This is going to combine both the deterministic and the stochastic. But we looked at 2 alternatives to this closed period single layer, which one of them says, alternative 1 says, just continue on with the current funding policy, but then the year that it would go to have 9 years remaining to 2038, set it back to 10. And then the year that would have been 8 years remaining, keep it at 10. So it's 10-year rolling amortization. And we did do one thing. Sometimes rolling amortization is frowned upon, especially particularly when you have this escalator, the 3% increases. In some cases, you're not paying your even interest on the unfunded. What we did for this is say, to make sure that's not happening, we took out the 3% payment escalator on the unfunded and made them level dollar. So really like 10-year financing, like you typically would see with like a mortgage. They're level dollar amortization. So we know that they're at least paying down some principal, because that's the way that would have to work. So that,
in reading this, and so when it's rolling, is that indefinite?
Yes, forever.
Yeah. Okay.
So we know, because this plan, Vermont's going to be here forever. So, and
Very happy.
that's kind of the thought.
Cue the state anthem. This is a good opportunity to emphasize again that this isn't meant to be like we have 2 alternatives,
Correct.
1 or 2. These are meant to be. These are things that exist out there. These are models that exist out there, and things like when we make the change, we started at the 10-year point here. Doesn't have to be that way. Did a 10-year roll, 10-year open, could be any number. So a lot of decision points, we had to make a lot of basic decisions just so that we could provide some indicative information. But all these things are what I think we're going to be talking about for the next probably couple of years.
And the focus is stability.
Yes.
Volatility and stability and
the trade-off.
And full funding.
Trade-off for the unfunded liability.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I get your point on alternative may have been a poor, sounds like there's 2 alternatives. There's infinite alternatives, but we just have 2 scenarios, possibilities. The second one, so that's one, very simple, just go to a 10-year rolling. And that's in public pension financing terms, 10 years is a pretty short period of time. But I think it's like if you're already, the way we thought about this was you're already at paying a 10-year, by 2027, you're already used to paying a 10-year amount. So just keep that kind of rolling into the future. But it wouldn't have to be that way. Alternative 2 is start the same way, continue to through 2027, and then the year that you have 10 years left, you're establishing what we would call like a legacy unfunded liability. So at that point in time, everything that's unfunded will be paid off by 2038. So you have this balance, but then what happens under the current policy is any new unfunded liability is expected to get paid down then over a 9-year period. In this case, this would say, no. That new source, that new unfunded liability that emerges in that year, that's going to get a fresh 10-year. It's going to get its own 10-year period to be paid off. And then the year after that, which would have only had 8 years to be paid off, that one's going to get its own 10-year period. So you're keeping track of these layers, and each one is getting paid off over, and sometimes they're gains, sometimes they're losses, but they're getting paid off over distinct 10-year periods. But you have obviously your big one that you know is going to get paid off by design through 2038, and then the other ones just kind of trickle on. So you'll see how this plays out, but it does a really good job of mitigating, particularly the very late stage volatility, while still observing this premise of, well, we want to have the we've been plowing forward with paying things off by 2038. It still does most of that effectively, but it doesn't punish late term investment losses and bringing those in by squeezing it into like a 1-year period.
Another really stupid question.
Sure.
So the plan was to get 100% funding 2038, but 2039, 2039, who knows what could happen? Maybe there's that miracle science discovery and that extends life another 5, 6, 7 years. And suddenly the stock market craters. That could happen in 2039. So I guess I'm sort of wondering, is it, anything, I guess it's the future is very unpredictable. 2038 was, I think, a great plan, but it doesn't stop time there. Time keeps going forward.
Well, I think that's the thing about the current policy, and what the implication I see is that whatever happens for 2039, you got to pay that back in one year, because by 2038, according to statute, the plan needs to be 100% funded. I mean, at inception, the plan wants to cost normal cost. Like if we were all to design a DB plan that covered the 20 of us in this room, the first year's we'd have no assets. The first year's contribution would be the cost of all of us accruing benefits. But then if Tim goes ahead and retires before we think he's going to retire, he creates unfunded liability. Now we're not paying normal costs. We've got normal costs plus paying for his, unexpected retirement. But ultimately the plan wants to pay. And I think that's what's neat about the 2038 is that it's like saying, okay, everything is unfunded, pay for it, get this thing back to where it wants to be, which is paying normal cost. And then to the extent you have gains and losses, I mean, what may end up happening, you mentioned a couple really extremes, stock market craters, people live 2 or 3 years longer. Theoretically, we're paying for sins of the past, bad assumptions, bad whatever, but get that paid for. And that going forward by 2038, going into 2039, these are all going to be 1 year, small gains, small losses, could be going either way, but they're all sort of balance out. That's the way that in a perfect world, the defined benefit plan is supposed to work. But I think the experience tells us now it's going to be, a huge downturn right before we have to have this thing paid off. And it's just bad luck.
Well, that's what I mean. I guess I'm not a math teacher. I'm kind of slow in this area, but it's like, okay, that was the best assumptions, 100% paid off, the best policy, 2038. Something could happen that, like you've shown us, something could happen that despite doing everything right, something happened and it didn't work that way. Or we were 100% paid off, and then in the future, things happen and suddenly we're not 100% funded anymore. That's a perfectly, right? Isn't that, it's a perfectly not ideal, but it's within the realm of possibility, right?
It definitely is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what we're doing here with some of the options we're showing, so 2030, a single layer closed amortization period, I think made a lot of sense post GFC when we had all of the issues that we had, and we weren't funding it at a appropriate level, I guess I'd say. So we needed to ease into that, and we needed a period of time to get there. And so I think that was a really sound decision at the time.
Yeah.
I think probably always knowing that as we approach this latter period, something would need to
I
be
got you.
done to mitigate the, the volatility that would happen at the end. And the types of alternatives we're looking at, and what I think are really positive aspects of them, are they're not endpoint sensitive, like whether or not it's an open period or a layered amortization period where you have a new 10-year period. They don't create that tail end volatility in the same way that this close. So I think, that was right for the time. And now as we're kind of approaching the end, we have to kind of.
We have a decision. We have a decision.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, that helps me understand. Thank you.
Yeah, I always use the analogy in my own head. It was like paying off the house mortgage. So I'm looking at 38 as, okay, that's the target. We're going to throw the dart and hit that. And then when I pay my house mortgage off, I'm done. But that's not the reality.
If the last payment was all of a sudden potentially 20 times as high as.
Right. But even if that, okay, fine, I liquidate everything and I now own my house, but as soon as I get that paper done, I still have liability.
Right.
As soon as I pay that off. So that from in my own head, now that makes more sense that this is a policy that we had that target of 38. Where do we go here so that it makes better financial and volatility sense moving forward.
Can I, so I would follow with that. And I think like when I think of the 2038 rate policy and an understandable story, 100% paid off. But like you're saying, it's different than a home mortgage.
Right.
A pension still operating.
Right.
Things change. So, but I get the point that right now, that's the future, but right now we're at sort of a decision point, recognizing that not even thinking about 2039 and going forward, we're at a decision point of what to do with the last 10 years where volatility can be quite impactful towards our base story, the 2038, our base policy.
I'll just amend that to, I'm not sure I don't think we're at a decision point today. I think we're at a discussion point. And I think the idea is, when we did this 5 years ago, we were keeping an eye on it. I think now we're getting closer. I don't know what the right time is. I think a lot of voices need to be in that conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think this board needs to be probably the leading voice in that conversation, just understanding what the different interests are in maintaining the status quo for some number of years, how and when to change. And so I think of this as really not a decision, but a discussion point for the time.
Yeah, policy, it's discussing policy and moving forward at a reasonable time and as fiduciaries, the most responsible way. Yeah.
So as we have this discussion, I think we need to remember that at least in Act 114, there are some benefits in the pension system that are key to paying off the funded liability at the schedule that was, at the 2038 schedule. And then even the pension reform before that also counted on the state making this, these contributions to 2038 and getting to full funding in 2038. I see the need to smooth this volatility at the end, and we do have some smoothing provisions already in place to smooth any 1 year's volatility over a couple of years. But I just think we have to if what we're trying to do is address the volatility, but along with that, we lengthen the time that the unfunded liability exists. We're also going to be, it's going to have an impact on what our promised benefits are that we negotiated with Act 114.
Can you remind me? I simply don't remember what's the impact?
Well, the most direct one is that there's a potential change in the COLA calculation that comes when the unfunded liability hits when the funding ratio hits 80%. And if what we do is inadvertently or you know, as a product of this, if we drag that out so that the funding level hits 80% later or falls below it later, that's going to change. That's going to change when the COLA changes, or when the discussion about how to change the COLA changes.
There are a lot of parts.
There's a lot of ifs and, you know, intention. There's a lot of good intentions there without a lot of strong language.
Thank you for reminding me. I had forgotten about that connection.
And I think we're going to start reporting on that. I want to say 26. I can't remember what the statute is, but we're going to start reporting on that item just as a matter of course. But I think that's one of that's why we wanted to get ahead of, we didn't want to kind of get to a point where we're saying, oh shoot, we've got volatility coming this year because of something. So it's to have time, space, and the vocabulary to have these conversations.
Exactly.
Yeah, the timing for this study is right on. I mean, it's just.
Now's the time, yeah.
Okay, so I know we're still, I am trying to be a bit of a time cop on this.
No problem.
Moving forward.
So alternative one, this is the old baseline under the current policy with 7% returns. And with that going to 10-year rolling, this is what the contribution scheme would look like. So it doesn't necessarily need to, you know, have these contributions to get to 100% funded. It's delaying the contributions, and then of course, you know, it's still paying for that for them beyond 2038. So it's a much smoother approach. If you look at the 6% here, you'll really see where this comes into play. It's a much smoother way to handle contributions and the tail volatility, you know, over a time with this rolling period amortization. The next slide shows kind of the downside of that from the funded percentage is that, you know, even with 7% returns, 10-year rolling, it doesn't quite get there in the 20 years. It's trending in the right direction, but it is always kind of pushing things out. And at this point, without, you know, a 10% return, it may never get there because it's always trending towards that line, but never quite getting there. And then the 6% one looks like this. It's even, so basically there's no free lunch. It's part of the trade-off of going to a method like this is that you're trading budget relief and not having to have these large contributions when it may be inopportune to a slower, longer path to getting to 100% funded or close to 100% funded. And then looking at some of these individual scenarios, this was one that we saw before, and this is what it looks like under this rolling 10-year rolling. So it completely takes out the peak up to $600 million contribution. And if I were budgeting, I would think this would be fantastic, particularly compared to the dashed line. On the other one, the other downturn scenario, pretty much the same thing. 10-year rolling is a pretty simplistic way to approach it that provides really smooth contribution patterns. From the standpoint of the funded ratio, that's what it looked like. This is what it would look like here. So on the other one, you remember it was getting over, in the current policy, it was still getting over 100% funded and staying there. This one, again, because of that relief in contributions and extending it out, it's not going quite as, you know, it's shying away from this 100% exactly. And then this other downturn scenario is more of the same. Again, it's getting very close to 100, but it's not quite as well funded as it is obviously under that their current policy, which is by design getting up to 100% by 2038. And then this is looking at the stochastic model. So under this alternative one, we saw this was our baseline where it trended downwards. The 50th percentile, and then layering on the 25th to 50th and the 50th to 70%, a 75th percentile, that range is really tight now. And we can put on the graphic from the other one just to see what it looked like before, what that range was running up here to $500 million. And now it's down here to in, you know, $240 million.
And just to emphasize that these are nominal dollars, right?
Yeah, and so these are
Inflation
even in,
adjusted, so.
these are even in nominal dollars, right? And again, here was the old funded ratio where it was getting there. Now we know even at the baseline, it's not quite getting there. And then it opens up, that contribution relief opens up more chances to sort of have a languishing funded percentage in the worst case scenarios.
So this all kind of stands for the unremarkable proposition that if you want the budget relief from an open amortization period, it's at the cost of funding.
And so now alternative 2, again, this is the current policy, 7% returns. This is 7% returns under the 10-year or the layered amortization. And conceptually, these numbers should be the same, because by the time we switch to this, we don't have any more gains and losses that should be extending into the future. But for the fact that the asset smoothing method that we talk about it being 5-year smoothing, but it's not really a discrete 5-year smoothing method. Like, okay, in 6 years, all 5 of the previous years are completely recognized. It's like this taking 20% and taking 20% and 20, that's your 5 years. It's multiplying something by 20% each year. And so there's a little bit of investment gain or loss that always gets pushed into the future. So the reason it's different out here is that one of them draws a line in the sand and says it will all still be funded by 2038. The other one is saying these new gains and losses, the tiny gains and losses, are getting put into these new really small 10-year periods extending beyond that. But the legacy unfunded liability is being paid for, but except for these tiny little slivers. And then you can see how it works under the 6% returns. You're getting some relief, but you're still paying off most of the unfunded liability by 2038. It's only the portion that's really happening in these last 5 or 6 years that it's getting extended beyond. We added a little button here at the bottom to just remind ourselves what it looked like under alternative 1, where it was this pattern. So the dashed line is staying the same, but the solid line is alternative 1, and this is what it looks like under alternative 2. So you're not getting quite the relief under this alternative, but you are paying off that legacy base by 2038, and we can see that on this page. Looking at this scenario, so you're still basically getting close to 100%. If we go back to alternative 1. It was much lower. And we were trending in the right direction, but it was a slow to get there. Under alternative 2, it's basically right under that. All these new 1% losses are getting funded over 10 separate 10-year periods. And then just to look at the difference between, this is our friend, the late stage downturn, and what alternative 2 would look like here. Most of this downturn that happens, it's getting paid for with this sub $300 million contribution, and then it's paying for at the end. And again, looking at this scenario in particular, back in alternative 1, put that up here. I left it on this one. This smoother pattern in alternative 2 looks like this. So it has more jumping around, but that's because it's intentionally funding a larger portion of the unfunded liability still by 2038.
Is okay. Matt, I'm just curious, on all of these, whether it's the rolling or the layered, post 2038 in your numbers here, that's the amortized payment in addition to the normal costs. Because previously we were looking at the drop off with the normal cost carrying forward after 2038. So this would be added to whatever that
exactly. So like on this slide, we know the level of normal cost is this level down here in the dash line. So this payment is normal cost plus these other layered amortization bases that eventually with beyond this projection, getting 7%, these basically all kind of drop off and eventually you get to it being normal cost, assuming that you don't have any gains or losses beyond a certain period of time.
Because eventually with layers, you're hoping, 1 year good, next year bad. Eventually will offset each other and roll off,
Yeah, got it. I just want to make sure that number was additive of both of those.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And then one last one to look here, just to demonstrate that this funded ratio does better than it does under alternative one. Look at the right one. So again, alternative one was smoothing things out. The contribution stream maybe looked better, but the funded percentage lags compared to alternative two, which by this time it is basically at 100%. Actually, it's at 99% out here. And then the contributions on stochastically under alternative two, 7% baseline. And remember, alternative one was the diagonal. This one has that blip. So the 50th percentile is here. And then here's the range from 25th to 75th percentile. So 50% of outcomes are here compared to at least the original version looked like this. So it's a much narrower. It's a much narrower there. And then comparing that to back to alternative one, it was, a wider range and still going out further. There were higher contributions under alternative two. Those are kind of dropping off. Most of those have dropped off, particularly in the bottom two quartiles. And then looking at the funded ratio, the baseline here getting to 100% like we knew it would under alternative two, and then layering on this middle 50 percentile of outcomes. Again, because most of the unfunded liability is still being paid for by 2038. Just the new bases cause a little bit of variance, a little downside here, but most of the time this doesn't look actually that different than the original version under the current funding policy. It's pretty close. A little bit of a wider band, but not nearly as much as it is under alternative one. So there's certainly a lot of trade-offs. We had talked about a couple things here. I think this is a pretty complicated slide, but for going through it, we're looking at just one scenario under alternative two, which is the late stage downturn. So this is that line that we don't like, and we wanted to show what this looked like for adjusted for inflation. So this $600 million number adjusted for inflation is still $447 million. So in today's dollars, it's higher, but it is certainly lower. We've seen this one before. This is how the 10-year layered approach works. And again, this one adjusted for inflation, actually, by the time you get out to this payment out here, this $210 million payment, that's in terms of today's dollars, that's not dissimilar from what you're paying right now. So we thought that was an interesting point. But just to layer on, you wouldn't have to use 10-year and some sensitivity. What if you were using 20-year layers? So you extended out that base. You still paid still paid off the legacy by 2038, but anything new gets 20-year layers. And so you would have some longer some relief beyond 2038 in contributions, but they would trend up a little bit, I think, if you were actually to go past this 20-year period. And you could see what the impact would be on just the difference between, the funded ratio is this. If you were to project these on, the 10-year layers is going to get to 100% or close to it faster. The 20 years is going to take a little bit of a longer period of time, but they're fairly similar under this alternative. And then the next part of this is just maybe for some review. This will probably be the opening part of any future conversations we have, but just talking about what funding policies are for public plans, best practices. They call them model policies, but what are systems using? So there's a white paper out there, originally issued 10 years ago, was updated. There was a working group that updated this last year, but most of the findings are pretty much the same. This here is just that, it is not done willy-nilly. There are policy objectives that they're trying to balance for all the stakeholders involved. This talks about the different structures. So I'll kind of get past this. This is that closed period look in the teal, whereas a rolling period or open is always kind of perpetually using the same period over time. But I really wanted to get to this slide here, which is to show that, according to the white paper, there are potentially different sources to use for amortizing different periods to use for different sources. So it's something to think about. So when you have, for example, plan changes that affect retirees, maybe you don't want to use a 20-year period to amortize that liability because the life expectancy for that group on average could be 12 years. So maybe it's more appropriate for like a one-time COLA change that impacts retirees to amortize that over a 10 or 12-year period, but other gains and losses maybe get 20-year periods, or assumption changes get 25. So there's different periods that we'll talk about. And one really important point, I think, is we talked about what we did here was we did nothing with the surplus. But in situations when you do have a surplus, there's a tendency to say, well, we're amortizing things over 10 years, like let's take a 10-year credit on the surplus. But model policy is to say, no, you could take a little bit of a credit for your surplus, but try to bank a lot of that surplus for a rainy day. And so the model policy is to do like a rolling 30 years on any surplus. And you're taking a little bit of credit for it, but you're pushing it out.
So as we go forward, I think we're gonna talk about some of these options, and Matt and team are the actuaries for Colorado, where they have this kind of more complicated layered amortization periods. And Matt showed me some of the charts. I think they'd be really helpful just to kind of see how these layers work and how it's not quite as simple, but it's actually not that complicated when you see it all on a sheet, and it does make a lot of intuitive sense. So I think that going forward from this deck is to have, really, this just gives us the tools. And frankly, I had a hard time understanding it when Matt said it to me before he walked me through it. So the hope is now, having been walked through it, we have this baseline tool, and then we can kind of start looking at what other systems do, what's kind of model practice in the space, and socialize it amongst our peers. And I think this is going to be a conversation over the next couple of years that we're going to have, with this being a pretty foundational document.
In my understanding, the screen on the screen to say it's a version of alternative one, where the 2038 legacy unfunded liability is sort of fixed, and we have different reasons, we have different factors that cause volatility in the unfunded liability going forward, and we recognize the different nature of those different sources and address them separately based on what's the quality of those things. This isn't having sort of an unending 10-year rolling unfunded life. This is not alternative to one.
Yeah, well,
this is a subtle version of two. Is it? Am I
yes,
that correctly?
Except for, I think you could look at the range of periods. Either, I think model practice is, I think if you were to take a step back in the paper, model practice is clearly layers, even though it's more complicated and you've got to, to explain, oh, we're doing all this, got this sheet of all these bases that maybe run for 20 years. And if you've got different components for each year, it could be 2 pages worth of bases. That's complicated, but that's still model practice. I think doing something like rolling is in the paper would be considered, as long as it would be acceptable practice, but with considerations, or as long as your period isn't too long. So maybe like here, it's like if you've got closed period layers 20 years, but if it's open period, maybe that's where the 15 comes into play. Like if you can do a rolling 15 year, don't do a rolling 20. But that's all sort of discussed in the paper.
Well, that was easy.
That's it.
We'll start assigning homework.
That's what I was going to say.
But I wanted to say thanks to Matt for this. This has been really eye-opening.
Yeah, it was a great.
Yeah, thanks for your attention on this. I know it's dense and complicated, but we had fun doing it.
Well, one of the things I was commenting before during lunch, I love the way that the graphs are broken down and being able to pull in.
It's too much if you can't do that. It's too much.
Exactly. And then be able to go back and
Yeah.
unwrap the onion after you do it, and then being able to pull in alternate two and see the two on the same chart. That was
Exactly.
fabulous.
Yeah. I mean, some of those, like the way you do it typically is you just run it in multiple pages, but we're already at 62. I don't think you wanted like a 250 page deck. So yeah, that worked out really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So, Mr. Chair, I was thinking maybe we could take just a quick 4 or 5 minute break and we have our friends from Empower here. We can get RVK and transition to the back half of our programming. I think we can, we'll all again try and police all the timing. We can kind of shrink the staff time, I think, towards the end as well if needed.
Excellent. Let's take a 5-minute break. Help yourself to another small cookie. I got a framing. All right, if we could. We just did an excellent job with our 2:30 break. And next on the agenda is Empower Quarterly Report. Welcome.
Mr. Chair, good to see you, and so wonderful to see many of you again for such a long time. It is a pleasure. Before I do a quick intro of the Prudential team, I've got Rob Luciani here. Rob is a senior executive in our government programs. Not only is he my boss, but so feel free to tell him what you want to tell him. But Rob wanted to come out here and meet all of you, and obviously thank you for the business, given our new recent contract. So thank you for here, Rob. We've got Joe Finey, Investments, Melissa Chumento, Client Services, Christine Green, Communications, Brian Feisick, who's one of our dedicated representatives, along with Owen Gillis, their retirement plan advisors. Chip Sandville, who's normally here, is on vacation. So that is the Empower team. So on behalf of all of us at Empower, thank you for being here. What I was going to do real quickly is just kind of share some observations that we're seeing in the industry right now. And then I'm going to take then Melissa's going to share the presentation as we've done in the past, right? There's two plans, there's the exclusive and the unexclusive, and we'll combine those and share some metrics and observations there. So any questions before I jump right in? Okay. And for those of you that have heard this a couple of times now over the last couple of days, I apologize, but look, volatility is the key. It's all about volatility, right? Participants, there's a lot of anxiety out there with participants, given everything that's happened with the tariffs in the news today. We have a new Pope, by the way, which is really wonderful. First time, an American Pope, Chicago, Pope Leo now. So that, volatility is the key, given everything we have. But across our Empower book of business, we're really excited that participants are staying the course, right? Maybe it's a combination of what they've been through over the last couple of years. But the good news is that participants are staying the course. They're understanding this is a long-term retirement account. They're also becoming more and more aware and engaging in these programs and understanding the financial markets, et cetera, so forth. So, the field report I will share here real quickly is we're experiencing a lot of phone calls with participants talking about the volatility. What should I do? They just want to talk to someone. But what's interesting from past is that participants today, some, including here in Vermont, are looking this as an opportunity to buy. They're being a little more aggressive. They're reviewing their asset allocation strategies and say, is this maybe an opportunity to buy, right? Because they're understanding the concepts of dollar cost averaging, et cetera, so forth. So we're seeing a little of that, not a whole lot of it, but it's good to know that people are staying the course and some are understanding that this could be an opportunity to buy, okay? So I am going to be real quick here because I want Joe Fine to cover some of the investments. Melissa, if you could share the presentation, thank you very much. As you know, here on the Vermont 403B, we're going to start with the larger plan, which is the non-exclusive plan, as you can see here. And on the next page is a listing of...
Gabe, this is the exclusive. This is the smaller one.
My apologies. I read the wrong headline. This is the exclusive plan. And in looking at the exclusive plan here, there is a list on page 3 of the plans that are included with the numbers. They're all under that master contract number. Those are the various schools. And on the next page is you'll see the executive summary as of March 31st. So the exclusive plan is at $161.8 million, representing $28.95. Past this report is the non-exclusive plan, which consists of, and I'm just going to tell you without you having to fly through it, is $39.9 million, representing 854 participants. So on a consolidated basis for the VSTRS program, exclusive and non-exclusive, we have about $202 million, representing 3,700 participants. So we're going to focus on the larger of the two right now here. As you can see, as I said, 2,800 participants. In terms of the executive summary on the next page, we're going to get into a little bit about, the investment utilization, and we're going to look at money in and money out. Those are really the two high levels here, and we'll break that down for you. If we can go to cash flow on page 8. Cash flow for the period, for the quarter, as you can see, your contributions were $3.5 million into the plan. Disbursements were also 3.5, so we had a net negative activity of about negative $75,000. And where I'll draw your attention real quickly, as you can see, quarter over quarter would be the change in value line. So we started with $163 million contributions in, distributions out, which we'll get to in a moment. But primarily the change in value, if you look at the last 2 quarters, that's the volatility that we've seen. That's the change in the market value appreciation of the securities in the portfolio, okay, in the individual funds. Contribution is about 6% for participants, and I want to go to the investment strategy utilization on page 13. How are participants investing their money and what are activities they're doing? Over on the left, you'll see the various investment strategies. My Total Retirement, which is a managed account solution, that's professionally managed accounts, pay for service. There are 111 participants representing about $3 million. Online advice is free online advice. 2 participants are doing that. The target date strategy, which are your target date funds, and the asset allocation models, which is, you remember as being Goalmaker, which is now Empower Goalmaker. That combined, as you can see, 15 and 40, 55% of that representing your participants and the assets there. If I do my math right, it looks like about $60 million in that strategy. And as you go down to the bottom, the do-it-yourself strategy, as you can see, that's quite a bit of participants. Right up there with your asset allocation, 40% are doing their own asset allocation investment strategy, representing about $95 million in assets, right? On the next page, on page 14, we kind of looked at people who are active versus people who are separated from service. And as you can see there, the story here is, as you can see on the separated from service, again, participants today, and even in these plans, are not just taking their money when they separate for service, but what could be legacy planning, but more importantly, look at the strategies that they're maintaining through retirement, right? So they're looking to grow, continue to be in the markets, asset allocate through retirement, if you will. So that's exciting to see when you got a good, healthy mixture of participants, because quite honestly, a lot of participants, as soon as they leave, they take their money. What do I do, right? So the participants here are pretty much staying in the plan and continuing to be asset allocated. When we're looking at money that came into the plan, at $3.5 million for the quarter, as you can see, it's broken down. $2.5 million went into before tax deferrals, $264,000 in Roth, employer contributions where it's applicable, and other is rollovers into the plan. People that had a 403B somewhere else and rolled it in. So 3.5 came in, and then you can look at the rolling 12-month period there, representing about the $13 million. And below is kind of a month over month, if you will, run rate. And there's some months that have higher activities than others, like June, for example. And a lot of it goes around the school year and activities that participants take. But generally, you could see some, you can get a trend line there of about anywhere from about $1 million, it looks like, on the various contributions that participants are contributing to the program. And we looked at contributions. Now on page 17, we're looking at distributions. So as I said, 3.6 million left the plan. Where did it come from? Well, 2.8 million came from separation of service. We had required minimum distribution for people over 72, right? 13 of those in service, service credits, quadros, no death, thank goodness, and other types of distributions. So 3.6 million for the period. Again, rolling 12 months of the 12 million, you can see the various components of the distributions that came out of the plan with a month-by-month running total below. And there's distribution. Now, loans in the plan, which is on page 19. I wish all my plans were like this. People are not taking loans, which is fantastic. I mean, look, it's there if they need it, but they are not taking a lot of loans, as you can see there. And I believe on the next page, I think there were 2 in March on page 20 of new loans. So as you can see, one here, one there, two there. It is available, but again, not available to every program, but for the plans that do offer loan provision, they're not.
The average government's 7%.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Yeah. And then the transfers. The next page, we get into GoalMaker. We've talked about this in past, GoalMaker being the asset allocation solution, utilizing the core funds in the plan. And as you can see, quarter over quarter for the period ending March 31st, it hovers around 1,100, let's call it 1,100 or 1,120 participants, representing $36 million in the asset allocation. The next couple of pages breaks it down by the different strategies, conservative, moderate, aggressive, their age group, and the corresponding assets in those funds. Again, very consistent with what you see in normal asset modeling. And then on the following page is a breakdown of the GoalMaker assets in the program versus non-GoalMaker assets. Again, GoalMaker, for those as a reminder, is utilizing the funds, the core options in the plan that consists of those asset allocation program. And the next two pages are, we gave you the name of the plan on top and the numbers of those plans, and I'm sure you can find your individual school districts, but we gave you a breakdown of all of the individual schools. 23 of these plans included here, and it kind of breaks down the assets, the participation, the eligibility, emails, investment options, what the utilization, what they're doing, how they're doing it for all of the individual schools over the next two pages. And the following then goes into the non-exclusive, and I'm just going to stop at the first page. A list of schools. There are 31 included schools in the non-exclusive on page 29. And on 30, that represents, again, the $38 million and 854 participants. So similar characteristics, but combined, again, $202 million, 3,700 participants, and those are all the schools listed there for you. Any questions before I just close it out with the the single deposit investment account, SDIA?
Brief one.
Absolutely.
Do you also provide investment advice to participants in their non-retirement accounts? Do you
Participants in non-retirement
accounts? Do you reach
accounts.
out to people who are your retirement customers and say, we're available to you to help you invest money that's not in a retirement account? And what is your do you establish that relationship? And if you do,
No, we do not. No, we do not. Our retirement plan advisors are all registered 65 advisors, and it's specific to the plan.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. No, great question. Thank you.
And Gabe, real quickly, the
Of course.
do-it-yourselfers.
Yeah.
Have you done any analysis, or most of those people in index funds, I would assume?
The do-it-yourselfers, it varies.
Okay.
The do-it-yourselfers are people that came over a lot of time. We haven't broken that down yet all the way, but generally speaking, when the plans transitioned over, 5-7 years ago now, if they were doing their own, they continued to do. Remember that the funds didn't change.
Right.
But all new enrollments today, I would say when the Gillis and the team are talking and Chip had talked with the team, they say you can do it yourself or, other things. But a lot of the target date funds came over the same. But today it depends on what a participant does, right? Because we're agnostic. So a participant that meets with one of the representatives, they can do it themselves. They can choose target date funds, they can choose an asset allocation solution, or they can choose to have a professionally managed account. So they have.
If I choose a target
choices.
date fund, I'm not considered a do-it-yourselfer.
No.
Okay.
You should not be. You should not be. Do-it-yourselfers are ones that are truly go through the process and say, I want this fund, that fund, and this one. So those are truly people that have created their own personal investment allocations. And it could have been before or new.
Thank you.
Okay. And to close the loop on the very bottom here on page 51 of the presentation is the single deposit investment account. And again, as of March 31st, we've talked about this. It's a $21.4 million representing about 700 participants. And on and that's invested in a stable value fund. That's why you see the change in value as being positive. And the final page there on 53 just gives you the types of the distributions. As you can see, 276,000, 100 participants took money out. 21 did a required minimum distribution, and sadly 37 had a death distribution of that. So that's what made up the 515,000. And you will continue to see the month over month. And this is, you've heard me say, this is a wasting trust. This is a wasting trust. I'm happy to take any questions before we transition over to the investment review that Joe Fine is going to be presenting. Very good, sir. Thank you. Joseph, take it away, sir. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, he's just pulling up his presentation. Thank you for saying.
He's not gonna start
It's
till
not
the
that
end.
kind of meeting.
But thank you for that. The next question is can everybody see my presentation? And the answer is yes, Joe. We're one step ahead of you.
Okay. Glad I made everyone
Well,
laugh.
you've got a question here, Mr. Connery. You referred to as Sean Connery, but somebody said, is that beard new, Joe?
Yes, it is new.
Well spotted.
A long time in the thinking.
We'll see how long I keep it.
Should we vote on, does he keep?
Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, the votes are in overwhelmingly. It's keep, but
I agree,
anyway.
I'm in that camp.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I know Gabe spoke the volatility, and that is a hot topic. But if we closed our eyes on March 31st and opened them last night or this morning, the S&P 500 has actually gained ground since the end of the quarter. And as many of you may be aware, markets are rallying today based on, I presume, the news of the new Pope isn't hurting, but there was a trade deal announced between the US and the UK. So as you can see on this page, if you go through the various bullets, I mean, the story of markets over the past several months have been tariffs, right? What is it going to mean? You know, hopefully this is a sign that we're going to continue to cut more deals, trade deals, and much of the turmoil is behind us, but obviously can't predict that. GDP growth was negative during the first quarter, 100% due to increased imports for the quarter. So imports make up a component of GDP, and that's why GDP was negative, because people and companies accelerated imports into the first part of the year based on the threats of the tariffs. So the end result of this was markets being negative for the first quarter, equity markets in particular, and some exceptions like international equity for a change, right? So foreign stocks did better, and doesn't have a huge impact on your plan, just a couple of the investment options because your lineup is predominantly indexed, but just take note that growth stocks did not do well, right? The Mag 7 stocks tied to AI, predominantly because of the DeepSeek announcement that came out earlier in the year, the Chinese AI startup. So these had a negative impact on certain investment options, and actually the growth fall off actually helped one of your investment options. So kind of a mixed bag. Also wanted to point out that we do have an exhibit on tariffs and where things have stood historically relative to tariffs, how markets react, et cetera. So feel free to view that on your own. I'm going to jump ahead to page 31. Which are our summary pages, and actually runs from page 30 to 32, but we're starting here because, as you know, we typically speak to any funds that have underperformed over the trailing 3 or 5 years. So, has been the case recently. We've been speaking to Calvert Equity, towards the bottom of page 31 here. And you could see poor Relative results for the trailing 1, 3, and 5 years moderates a bit for the trailing 10. But we have seen this historically. This fund, because of the way it's classified by Morningstar, is either at the top of the large growth heap or the bottom of the large growth heap. So when growth stocks are doing poorly, like they did for the first quarter, you could see this drastic outperformance for the fund. And when growth stocks are doing really well, which has been the case for a number of the past calendar years, we see the exact opposite. So no causes for alarm there. And on page 32, the other option we wanted to mention, I spoke about AI and DeepSeek, the Chinese startup. So the Impacts Global Environmental Markets does invest heavily in information technology, the information technology sector. So also had a poor 2024. So that's what's dragging all these results down. Now for the year to date, you can see it's behind benchmark and behind the peers. Since the end of the quarter, since growth stocks have turned around, that's what's been leading the market back, although all segments have participated. We now, as of yesterday, checked this morning, since quarter end, the fund's been doing really well. And now if we were to give you a year-to-date exhibit, it would be in the top half of the peer group. So again, the fund is behaving the way we would expect. So that's it for the prepared remarks. Again, with the index offerings and the target date offerings, which are make up the bulk of the options, everything's looking pretty good on a relative basis. It was a tough quarter, and we are seeing that volatility. So unless there are questions or comments, I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Joe.
Joe, thank you very much. And Gillis and Brian, thank you very much for what you're doing in the field. Greatly appreciated. So on behalf of all of us at the Empower team, thank you for the opportunity to serve you, your participants, your retirees. We're very honored for our new contract, and we're very excited to be partnering with RVK, your new consultant here. And the best is yet to come. I really believe that. So back to you, Tim. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I also did want to say too, I know Gabe and Rob are looking to get on the road as soon as you can. You're welcome to stay. You're also, there is no pressure, as I understand.
Well,
there's a long road ahead.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Yes, they will do it. Thank you. But appreciate that. We'll leave after the presentation when you go into executive session. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Very nice.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may.
You may.
So our next presenters are from RVK. We have Sarah and Jonathan here. This, our work with RVK, as many will recall, started last year when we wanted to kind of take a level set look at all of our supplemental plans and really just, take a look at the investment lineup, take a look at the governance practice, see what we might want to accomplish over the next few years. And as we did that, we realized there is a lot of work we want to do on, investment policies, on governance practices. And so we went out and did a bid to bring an investment advisor on a fiduciary long-term. And so that's where we ended up going through that process, received a compelling proposal from RVK, and are very grateful that we're now at the start of this relationship. We've been working the past couple months on a proposed work plan. So what Jonathan and Sarah will present today is, I want to emphasize proposed, because we are very interested to hear feedback either today or, you can reach out to me, we can schedule time, we can get another board meeting. But I wanted to give you the broad strokes of the work that we want to do in the upcoming years with a focus on this year. And then we also asked them to just present some quick ideas on some of the market volatility we've been seeing as well. So with that, I'll stop talking and thank you very much for making the trip up here.
And I appreciate the warm introduction, appreciate the warm welcome. We're really thrilled to have the opportunity to work with you and continue, frankly, the work that was begun with the project and the relationship there. Sarah and I are, as Tim mentioned, going to be walking through elements of the proposed work plan. I'll be talking at a higher level, some of the shared vision points, and then Sarah's going to dig down into really what we're doing on a core day-to-day blocking standpoint. And then we'll be talking about the market volatility perspective, sharing some context and some perspective points of view about what the board and frankly individual participants can and could be doing with regard to looking at those. So looking at page 2 in here is really we've identified 6 areas of focus that really were shared vision points that carried through both from the review as well as the RFP process. And really the first one of which I would say is enhancing participant outcomes. I think that's a clear shared vision that I think transcends everything we do. From that standpoint, it is a look at governance topics, a look at plan investments, a look at plan operations and investment fiduciary support items. Looking at the second one, evaluating plan competitiveness. We are data-driven wherever possible and look to provide data-driven insights. And if there's qualitative overlay to be able to put on top of that, that is obviously very important. And so working closely with really all the stakeholders, including yourselves, but staff, Empower, other stakeholders to help develop monitoring dashboards, assessments, and benchmarking frameworks to be able to put in place an ongoing monitoring framework. That's a very critical part of what the board has hired us to do, but we think it's a great best practice within investment programs. Third one, providing support for administrative functions. Fundamentally, this relates to having another independent point of view to be able to support your staff, points of view from Empower and others about administrative operations and topics in that area. Moving forward on the fourth, providing consolidated reporting. Our goal is not to necessarily replicate or repeat information, but to provide additional points of view from a dashboard standpoint for being able to distill down into some of the key metrics and about the investments, but about the plan in an integrated partnership way with the state, with Empower as well, to put forward informational reporting. Improving participant education and communication. Ultimately, we are not directly delivering participant communication and education, but we look forward to being able to share perspectives, points of view, items that we've seen in other similarly situated plans in partnership with your existing effective communication program. And then lastly, reducing participant plan expenses. I would say reducing is a goal, but I think it's perhaps could be said optimizing, if you will, for value. Cost and value in that vein is important, and importantly as well from a fiduciary principle standpoint, considering the effective understanding of revenue dynamics frameworks for that and how value is effectively measured and monitored. So those are some of the high level points, and I think we're very aligned in that. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to be walking through really how we're going to be carrying this out.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we really had the distinct privilege of working with staff last year and you all on a comprehensive review where we were able to evaluate the investments, the plan, administration, and a lot of different aspects of the plan, which give us a lot of insight into maybe areas of potential focus. And also, we had a lot of discussion with staff already this month and last month on maybe items that we can prioritize. So what we have in front of you here is some of the focus area across all those different objectives that you all have for your plans that we think are important for us. Some of them are more policy or process oriented, such as developing investment policy guidelines or developing manager monitoring policies and having a monitoring dashboard that the board can review and use maybe specific guidelines to determine if a manager should be potentially placed on watch or should be eliminated, or what types of actions to be taken depending on performance and qualitative measures. So these are some process-oriented items, but there are also more items that we covered in the review, such as maybe taking a closer look at the target date fund, taking a closer look at certain aspects of the investment menu that we want to look at, or the plan demographics. So we really worked with staff on maybe trying to pull an agenda together based on those different items to maybe try to sequence them in a way that prioritize things that we think are more foundational. For example, something we like to do with our plans as part of onboarding is what we call a retirement readiness review, which is a project that we do to taking a closer look at the plan demographics, benefits available to participants, their behavior, to understand maybe to get a better picture of the retirement adequacy and the role that this specific plan plays for them, how much they need to save, what types of engagement strategies the plan needs to have with them. And we think this review really helps informs a lot of the other items that we do afterwards. One other important item is doing a governance review and the investment policy work that we discussed. So that's also going to inform a lot of what we do, but it's also a good way to document all that great work you all already do every quarter, reviewing the managers and evaluating the plan more closely. So on this next page, what we tried to put together, RBK and staff, is a proposed strategic agenda that really includes items, flags them in green, items that we want to review more closely in the near term in 2025, and then sequential items that we think maybe are appropriate to take a closer look at potentially next year, such as the investment menu review or the target date fund evaluation. There are additional items here on this list that may not make their way to you, that we're working behind the scenes on with staff. We may bring recommendations to you depending on the outcomes of those reviews, such as, for example, this year we'll be doing a plan fee benchmarking. There may not be room on the agenda to bring it in front of you. We'll see how it goes, but we'll be doing that work regardless behind the scene, and we're providing you all with status update on some of that work. Priority now for us is to work on putting together performance reports that are relevant to your board and maybe provide actionable items and recommendations to you on a regular basis. So that's something we'll work closely with staff on in the short term. And then we'll also have a couple of other projects that we'll be working on, and we'll be updating you on them on a regular basis. I think maybe one thing I want to leave you all with is that you all, based on the review that we did and all the work we've done with you and meeting with you last year, we already know that you all are really working hard, you and staff, to make sure that you're offering participants a retirement vehicle that is, efficient, cost-effective, and provides them with a good decision environment to make good retirement outcomes for themselves, good retirement decisions. And our role here is simply to support you all and partner with you to achieve those goals, to leverage the experience we've had with other plans that are trying to do the exact same thing you are doing. So we're hoping today or later, as we go through the year, to be getting your feedback and guidance on how you think we should direct our work and any focus areas or areas of work or review that you'd like us to focus on. That's really tremendous and helpful, because you all know your plans much better than we do. So we look forward to that collaboration with you all.
And just to reiterate, that can come, today, our main intent here was to just get everyone in the same room, so you know the people that you'll be working with over the next months, years, whenever. If you have anything, please bring it to me directly, and we can make time on an agenda, or we can just talk about it offline. I'm always here to hear that kind of feedback. And I just also wanted to reiterate that some of the best value, I think, in addition to their expertise that RBK brings, is just the exposure to other plans. We know our plan very well, but we don't know other plans. So having the ability to, have someone say, what about that? Or, that's been immensely valuable, at least from my end, at the staff perspective. And so that's some of the value we're hoping to leverage, over the course of this relationship.
Your time.
There are no comments, I think, and now it looks better.
Yeah, or there, we're happy to take questions, but we also recognize that we're hoping to get you on the schedule as well too.
I guess, I'm sort of, maybe this was a question from Power, I'm not really sure. We talked about the volatility in the marketplace, and it's confusing to know what's going to happen. I wonder what, like, as far as the deregulatory process that seems to be going out in DC, whether it's the SEC or banking regulators, whether it's RVK or whether it's Empower, are there concerns there? Are there risks there? Or is that overall?
Yeah, I think we probably both come to it with Empower and RVK come to it with additional and potentially different, but I think there's probably some shared points of view on that. I think that we're waiting to see in some ways what some of the final regulatory outcomes are going to be. I think that there's obviously different regulatory regimes that exist in different times and different periods. I would say that regulatory guidance can be a direction toward actions that sponsors and fiduciaries and boards can take, but it doesn't necessarily. There may be things where they become a prohibition from where they were previously potentially more of a directive. And I think that it's those dramatic changes that we probably are focusing most in on, and those could be, you name it, whether or not it's pecuniary, like financial only, or social objectives, and whether or not there's a harder or a softer line taken on that could impact potentially some of the risk-informed ways that certain investments get taken. But I think that by and large, I would say regardless of party or political matters, I think that there's a recognition that retirement outcomes are critically important for those who put you into office and keep you in office. And in that vein, we try to take a long view and a perspective on where are the items that are going to really directly impact actions and obligations of fiduciaries, and make sure you can't always get out of the noise of the day-to-day, but trying to look at the bigger pictures of those, and while keeping a solid mind of what either a deregulation or a different regulation might actually impact you on a day-to-day. So sort of a non-answer, I recognize, but at the same time, I think it's hard to say quite yet when some of the rulemaking that would accompany any of that, even if it runs much quicker, potentially, it's difficult to say with certainty what it might actually mean, except for the fact that there are certain priorities that may be distinctly different.
Rob, did you want to talk about what Ed's doing and what we're doing in RV? Please.
I was at a conference in DC where people are speculating. We just had Secure 2.0, which I'm sure everyone's very much aware of. That took years in the making. It was so encompassing. The bets these days are not that we're in line for anything else for a while. That's not to say there might be individual pieces like you talked about that pop up.
Right.
We're very active as RVK is in Washington to kind of try to make sure that we're giving the best information as we can to politicians. The biggest buzz these days is there more Rothification, because it's the tax policy that likely would have the most impact. But overall, seeing another Secure Act, or where there's going to be all these big changes, there's a lot of speculation that would be pretty tough to get done because a lot was already done. But to the same point, that's part of our job, is helping bring to you guys what we do learn from there. So hopefully we'll be ahead of it. And I know you've done a great job with Secure 2.0. We'll be prepared for what's next and the partners in it.
The final point I'll make is from Empowers is what our CEO Ed Murphy's been saying, in the media and at these industry conferences. And this is where all of us are aligned. It's all about the participant, right? Ed Murphy's been saying very clearly that participants need help. Not enough participants or individuals. Let me rephrase set of participants. Individuals, Americans, do not have a retirement plan. How do we help them? And you think about it from the government's perspective, they want that, because the more people that have it are less dependent on the government. So there are a lot of interests focused on how do we help individuals achieve better outcomes? How do we help them help themselves? What can we do to help them? That's a lot out there. So things, whether it's tax policy and, administrations, it's not going to happen overnight, but that's kind of the goal. Unless you guys, that's pretty much it. We're all aligned on that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And we, the fluctuation in guidance and regulations that happens with administration is certainly a concern, and it's something we're monitoring. But we'll take a deeper dive into the regulatory updates as in one of our meetings, upcoming meetings. Because this is a topic that deserves a lot more time.
Yeah.
And we can also, in that review, we'll focus on regulations, which is one piece, but there's also litigation that is happening behind the scenes. And a lot of it is significant, and it also defines the landscape and how plan sponsors react most of the time. So we'll also include an update on litigation and also any potential legislation, which, as they said, we don't expect any legislation that is significant, but regulatory changes are very likely. And then also litigation is important. So more to come.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, a tangible example perhaps for the teacher's retirement, the 403B would potentially be vehicle type with CITs.
Big time.
I think that is
Yes.
that is something where, there does appear to be so elements of bipartisan support for that, but I think that whether or not that makes it through policy.
Do you mean that investment in those are commingled investment trusts would be allowed where they're not
Permissible investments, correct.
And that's, I would just say as an example of it, a topic that may have bipartisan support.
Got it. Thank you for taking the time. I know you got to run.
No, I have a very stupid question. I don't know, but so I'm just looking at the slide and it says vendor reviews. Because I know at my school, we have a lot of different investment companies that, that on the list that they can choose from. I do encourage the members to go with Empower just because they are evaluated here in the meetings and things like that, and you present to us. Seems very transparent. But so is that reviewing so it's for this.
Yeah, we don't have any role with those.
Those okay, I just wanted to.
Great question.
Yeah.
So this would be like looking at at Empower and.
Right, yeah, we look at Empower and it's like those ones, if you want to go with one of them, then you're kind of on your own and you want to do, hopefully.
Almost on your own. I think that the school district is responsible for vetting that list at some level.
Okay.
Yeah, as the plan sponsor.
They're responsible for making sure that there isn't anything too shady on the list.
Okay,
but I'm not
sure.
I don't
know how serious.
I reacted
Too many lawyers when you say shady. Too many lawyers. Be careful.
Any questions? Well, I guess
we have a long list.
On the regulation or deregulation. I mean, I think the credit of the treasurer's office and Empower and you all. I mean, it's not like if I think of Trump 1, I think of SPACs, I think of crypto and crypto coin, but those are not the things that are, if teachers are doing those.
Plan sponsors are not considering crypto and all these exotic investments.
Exactly.
They've taken the position, as well as most boards, that's not a retirement asset. That's too speculative. No.
Thank you.
But the DOL may reverse their
if they do
strident position on it.
Then you as a board make the decision.
Yeah.
But we don't have clients. Yeah. I don't know about you. We don't have any clients asking for that stuff. We just simply don't.
Certainly not in DC.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, no, great questions, and we appreciate the engagement on that. I guess, Tim, I think that a lot of conversations already occurred about volatility. I think there's a slide down, which slide up has obviously continued. I think that comments about volatility, I think are appropriate, but I think what our real focus on this presentation is about market timing and the risk and challenge of doing so, and some practical messages for boards and plan sponsors, and quite frankly. Drawdowns on the next slide, obviously over various historical regimes, follow similar patterns. Things go down, things generally, what we've seen is they come back. They can have different durations of that. Obviously, the most dramatic one here is COVID in the purple. The red, which is recent, there's actually just due to when this was printed and finalized. I mean, there's that red line has now come back a lot, which I think is
It's crazy.
Credit to, whether or not you close your eyes and come back a month later and then you find out things are better.
A day
But
later.
fundamentally,
An hour later.
I think
An hour
it
later.
illustrates something on the next slide where there is another truism that perhaps doesn't necessarily come out of this. And this is kind of contextual information where Sarah's going to walk through what, plan sponsors and boards can and we think should consider in these climates, is that with one exception over these various regimes and periods, I think it's a compelling figure to look at the fact that 1, 3, and 5 years after these major drawdowns, we saw reversion on this. And if you had gone to cash when you had gotten back in, I mean, those greens presume you stayed the course. So the red, if you will, that 1 year post GFC, which is what it was, that was a bit of a prolonged example. But generally speaking, we can't predict the future, but the evidence, at least from past regime challenges, does indicate staying the course. There is some evidence that it's profitable, if you will. And I think this feeds into things like rebalancing into, prudently into dips, considering your long-term objectives always, but considering the fact that you may not be smarter than the market. And I think that the next page on this really, I think, hammers that home too.
It's very diplomatic.
Even investing professionals, I think, should approach market timing with a lot of humility, in the sense that missing the best days, if you will, you effectively have significant impact. And obviously there's different analysis points you could look at this. This is a more simple approach. Just basically, if we just take every single daily return over a trailing period and you just take out the best of those days, you just miss those. Instead of being invested in all of them, 5 best days out of 20 years, you drop 2.5%. If you take out 10 best days, you drop 4.2% on this. And if you take out 15 best days over this 20-year period, you're dropping 5.5% and below a 2% return on this, from almost an 8% return annualized on the S&P 5. So it's just a point of view prospectively that you have to be very mindful of the fact that market timing, while it sounds great in a perfect world, it requires 2 things at least. It requires you to know exactly when to get out, and it requires you to know exactly when to get back in. And oftentimes, people may be able to pick selling into the sale, like selling into the dip, but the conviction to get back in exactly from cash in is going to be it's so critically important, because the market will move before you even can think about it in that. But what we've at least seen in this, and I think the single day analysis shows some of that, but you have to be I think you have to approach this with humility as an individual saver, individual participant, but also as a board of trying to give participants a structured set of tools and resources that I think Sarah's going to talk about here, that I just wanted to set the context.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jonathan. So before we get into that quickly, how have participants been responding so far? And Gabe touched on that already. So what we've seen with the data is that the majority of folks have really stayed the course. It's great. And we got data already from 4 major record keepers, even after we put this together. But we're talking 2 to 3% at the most that have done any trading in their portfolio. A few less than that have changed their deferral rates at all. It's a bit early to see the whole picture, and we're still waiting for more detailed information. But what we've seen in prior markets is that target date investors and those who are in an asset allocation portfolio, like managed accounts, these are folks who tend to not react so much and don't trade as much. So we expect to see a similar pattern. Those who are in the core menu investing on their own are the ones who have seen them in historically trading more, which makes sense because these are folks that already said that they want to take charge of their investment. That's why they're in the core menu on their own. So it's not unexpected, but what's really great to see is that folks that are in an asset allocation tool or target date funds have not done so, which is also represent a big portion of your participant base, or today at least are in Goal Maker, for example, and are diversified. So And that was really great because what we've seen in Q1 and in that period of heightened volatility in the beginning of April is that this diversification actually really paid off. Something we couldn't say for a long time. So we're really happy, relieved to be able to say that. You may remember at 22, there was a bout of volatility where even fixed income safe havens really underperformed. It's been challenging with clients to talk about diversification in some years when US equities has been the outperformer every single year for a long time. So definitely diversification paid off, and having a diversified portfolio, which is something that really helped, whether it's being outside US equities or being in fixed income or other asset classes like real estate, for example. Now, something we always get from plan sponsors in times like this, understandably, is what can we do? Is there anything we can do? And there are things we can do. But before we get to that, maybe the first thing we like to tell plan sponsors is that you are probably already doing a lot of the things that you need to be doing. You are monitoring your managers. You are managing a long-term retirement plan for participants. So always taking the long view is important. You already have a process in place to review your managers, review vendors, and take steps as needed. We, as your consultant, we're already behind the scene reviewing them on a regular basis. And if anything happens that really requires immediate attention or action, we will make sure to let you know of that if anything is out of the ordinary. So sticking to your fiduciary process, documenting those discussions and elaborations, and doing your regular reviews is the most important thing that's already taking place. The second thing that you could potentially do is take a look at the communication your folks are getting, your participants are getting. Gib and the team already talked a bit about that. They have their own engagement plan with participants in times like this. Maybe taking a look at those engagement plans and making sure that they are providing the information that participants need. Then some of the information that Gabe and Johnson already talked about, like the importance of not trying to time the market, the value of diversification, can really go a long way, because folks really look up to you as their employer to give them some guidance in times like this. And
if I could, Sarah, one of our key tools in that effort, I think, was when contracting with Empower was Chip and team on. I think they, we've talked to Chip in the past month multiple times, and just kind of they are often the front line for folks coming in, and I think they, the whole team, but Chip with his depth of experience with the plans, I think is such a valuable resource on that front. So just wanted to note that.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
And maybe last point on communication, making sure that folks are getting communication through different channels is valuable, because not everyone interacts with their account the same way. Some folks will want to talk to a representative, but others would rather just go online and check their account value. Others will just interact with emails, and maybe if you send them an email, that's the best way to communicate with them. There are also plan sponsors that are thinking about maybe we should include some information about the DC plan and the market in our employer newsletter, which really goes a long way also, because there are folks that maybe will ignore Empower's email, but will read an email if it's coming from you, or will check that newsletter for important information. So having maybe some context there can also be valuable. And lastly, in terms of things that you can do to really help participants, I would say these are challenging times, but these times are a great opportunity to really examine your active managers in particular, because these are the ones, that are meant to add value during times of volatility and downside action in the market. So a rising tide lifts all boats, but in times like these, you really expect them to shine, and that's the goal. So it could be a good time to take a closer look at your managers, and that's what we're doing. And, working with Empower to understand how folks are engaging now and how they're responding. Trading activity, is it similar to what we're seeing in other plans, or is it anything out of the ordinary? Can really help, us all refine engagement channels and communications with participants if we see anything out of the ordinary. And finally, if you're making any changes to your plan that is significant, if you're, for example, making adding or removing a fund that requires a blackout period where folks will not be able to make changes to their investments. What we tell plan sponsors, it maybe consider the market. If sometimes, are volatile, folks sometimes need to have a sense of control, and getting an email, oh, you're not going to be able to invest for 30 days is not maybe the best idea during times like these. But beyond that, I think the most important message is you guys are already doing a lot of the things you need to do, and just the long-term view is best view in those times. So I'll stop there.
So I think that's, mostly what we wanted to present for RVK. We have our work plan that we're going to be working on. If folks have any other questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. But again, very grateful that you're on board and that you made the time to come up to meet everybody today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Excellent.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman. Be well, everybody. Thank you. Wonderful to see you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks, buddy.
No, because we've got a train. We just got that.
Thanks so much. This was
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Grab a room.
Sorry.
They do predictions on it.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. You as well. I'll see you.
Take care. Good job.
Yes, nice to meet you. Wonderful job. Wonderful job.
See you around.
Thank you, everybody.
Chair, everyone else.
Thank you
so much.
Safe
Be well.
drive to New York.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is the disability recommendations
Yes.
from the Medical Review Board. The information was provided.
Our quorum might have just dissipated for a moment.
Yeah, okay.
Just don't.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, we're 3 right now. So let me go.
We got all the backups though.
Yes.
For the people who aren't here.
100% of that.
Backup.
Yeah, it doesn't do us any good. The backups,
The backups.
backups for people who are still here.
Here's the code. It's like that's.
Yeah, and then the exclamation point.
There.
Yeah.
The year and then.
All right, back to court.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
Okay, the first disability recommendation is for Michael Metz. The information is in your packet. Do we have a motion?
One motion for executive session.
I don't think we need to if unless there's discussion on the actual.
Approval of the board's recommendation with respect to Michael Metz.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Second recommendation from the Medical Review Force for Karen Neubauer. Do we have a motion?
Make that motion as well.
Okay, motion and a second. Discussion on the recommendation from the Medical Review Board? Hearing none. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Mr. Chair, just before we move on to the next one, I think just an opportunity to acknowledge Brianna Howard. Brianna manages our disability.
Oh, yes.
So all the work behind the scenes that gives you a clean package and a solid review. She's spending hours and hours doing.
Absolutely.
So it's good to meet her in person.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we have the third position.
Full board.
Full board, 3 signatures, almost,
Yeah.
not yet, but
This will be the first month.
Yeah.
Next month you'll see.
excellent.
3 signatures.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Final one is staff update. And if I can, I think I know there's probably a young lady waiting on Justin. So I want to make sure.
Daughter, to be clear. What's discussed at the board stays at the board.
Yeah. So I want to make sure he gets to pick up on time. So let's start with the,
Yeah, Bill.
great.
So I think we realize that often contracts come to you folks and it's very piecemeal. And so you see maybe the street view versus the zoomed out of what it looks like at the 30,000 foot. So I think what we wanted to start doing probably at this sort of quarterly interval is be able to provide a snapshot of all the contracts and showing here's what's upcoming, just so you have a better sense of, so many different contracts, touch Visters that, are administered and, through staff. And so we want to just sort of provide that overview. So it's a constant roadmap. So, sometimes we'll say, oh, this contract's coming, but you just have really a sense of the cadence of what's upcoming. If an RFP goes out that, inputs wanted on, or just, timelines. And so I think that's what the goal of this is. It'll, I think, look like this, depending on feedback, obviously. And then the other piece is, instead of just coming for approval, I think we just want to give a little bit of background, which I think we haven't always had the time to go back and zoom out and just explain a little bit about how contracting works. And really just at a high level, we're not gonna, I realize it's the end of the afternoon, we're not gonna really get down into the nitty gritty, but just wanting to explain that, sort of like how Brianna does all this amazing work to get, a disability retirement application package to you, just to let you know, sort of with some amount of confidence, to instill that when contracts get to you, it's not sort of a willy-nilly. It's not, oh, hey, take a look at it. Who knows if we'll get approval? Because, there's often many levels of sort of state agency approvals outside of this office and this floor and this board. And so just want to explain that a little bit. If Bill, could I see one? Oh, back one, please. Oh, sorry. Then number 2, please. There you go. And so just giving an idea that there's basically what's known as Bulletin 3.5, which is, I don't know how long, maybe 100 pages of regulations that govern it's a lot of all of our contracting, everything from how you put out an RFP, when you can put out an RFP. So just to know that everything all the contracts that interface with Visters all are subject to this other ecosphere of rules and procedures. And so it also, the Attorney General's office will always run things by them generally before it comes to final approval time from like the board, for instance, just because we don't want you folks to see something and then we have to go find out, we have to go renegotiate all these points. So just giving you the general idea that this is it's very prescriptive. It is, the state entities overall want very uniform conditions, depending on what service is, but so that, the state is best protected if anything goes wrong generally. So, okay, thank you. It's like we've done this before, Bill. And just to zoom out, I think sometimes you may see contracts and we're saying, oh, this one's for 2 years, or just to give an idea of, there's different intervals because there's different kinds of contracts. So we have what's called a contract waiver plan that we actually submit to the Agency of Administration. And it's certain contracts, because of the service they're provided, like LRS and Empower, they impact so many people and it's so disruptive for us to change providers. If we tried to go change, Empower, for instance, if every 2 years that it would be a mess, right? Can you imagine the communications for participants, like the amount of
for only a year.
I was going to say the staff burden of trying to offload data like that. And so certain contracts, we do have a few that are just so onerous that you're allowed to go for a longer period of time. It doesn't impact the fact that you can still terminate them under the standard reasons. You can not renew, you can do RFPs and then renew. So you still have a whole bunch of options, but it does provide a certain amount of continuity for some of these more difficult ones. So just something to be aware of, that sometimes we'll say, oh, this is for a longer period. Can I have one more, please, Bill? And so this is what except for that odd Cormag in that original box. This is going to be sort of what I think you will see to spoil a little bit. This all comes from, I have a larger database with all the contracts for the treasurer's office, and but this is just for you folks. And this is just trying to give a highlight of all the contracts that sort of in one way or another can impact Visters, and just showing that there's a range of dates. They're all in various, they're either in an original agreement, they're in an amendment, how many years of extensions are available. So just trying to provide an overview in a helpful way. You'll see that, you know, all our contracts are going to be over different periods of time. So it's not like we're going to have, next July, every contract's up for review. So it's sort of we're always engaged at some level in either an RFP or an extension or amendment process. And so that's just trying to let folks see the timeline just in general. So can I have one more? And then I think the other piece that I'm going to try and do is sort of the highlights. I'm going to try and give us sort of coming attractions, just so folks can see, you know, as you think about what you may be seeing. So we do have Hickok and Boardman, Delta Dental, VHI, VBA are all coming up. There's certainly decision points to be made on, you know, on all those in terms of extensions. Certainly have the ability with, you know, some of those to, and how it works. So now that we have 5 years for a lot of these contracts under our standard contracting provisions, there are sometimes some decisions to be made. Do you want to do a 1 year? Is it best to do a 3 year? You know, so there is some amount of strategery that goes into thinking about this. And so, so I think what we're going to do is, you know, keep this piece on the coming attractions and just keep giving this. So that way, you know, sometimes like last year with Empower, we would touch base on Empower once or twice. And now, you know, because it was such a large contract. And now I think the idea is we'll do that, but we also will give folks the zoomed out so you understand what's coming up next, where it fits into our overall sort of contract structure. So I think that was just the point of this, trying to get this up and running, just to have the chance to zoom out. In addition to sort of when you hear about contracts, you sort of understand the whole map.
Oh, this is really helpful.
Goes with the theme sort of meeting some vendors, and
yeah,
does take a lot of folks to operate what we do here, and we're very reliant on our vendors and very reliant on Justin for all the work he does on processing these contracts, and it's not easy.
No, not at all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's a big part of your time doing, like, I'm thinking about monitoring the supplemental plans, but also just contracting in general relative to how much time we spend on participant services and kind of managing the office of getting pensions processed properly.
It's actually a fair amount of my time. It's not as much this vendor management, you know, I wouldn't say it's a major portion of the whole division's time. Personally, like working with Justin, this is a big, making sure all the pieces are in place at the appropriate junctures, and just trying to think ahead. I mean, that's why we're bringing folks like RVK on board and trying to understand, you know, like that was a circumstance where, hey, maybe there's something missing, you know, and that's actually sometimes harder to do, to, you know, instead of, oh, we always have this person, like John, you probably remember when you brought on Hickok and Boardman the first time, and all the value that they provided, that came about because, wait, something's missing here. We need some additional help. So.
And that was huge. I mean, as we RVK, you know, we had that covered, then all of a sudden it was gone.
Yeah.
And having them back stronger is a big plus.
Yeah.
And now you're fully staffed.
And pretty stable.
Yeah.
In large part, actually, due to Nicole and a lot of the management she's brought to the office, just sort of organization we have. I feel like, you know, there was a lot of turnover for a good period of time, and it's quieted.
Go ahead, Jinx.
Yeah. It's exciting. And clearly an improvement in council, as we can all say. So the last thing we just wanted to talk about is legislative update, and so there hasn't been a lot on our agenda, thankfully, this year. Colin accepted from this conversation. Probably been quite a lot on Colin's agenda this year. With respect to the retirement systems, it's really focused on that waterfall piece that we've talked about the past couple meetings. That's something that came about in Act 114, and a key part, Perry, to getting funding of the PEAAA, which is the account that will ultimately lead to coal enhancement once we certain benchmarks and have sufficient funding. So we've been banging that drum the whole session, and I know in the Senate version of the budget bill, they sort of reverted to the what we had last year. Last year, what happened was so backing up, the House version basically foreclosed any waterfall money by saying anything else is just get swept and not be processed through the waterfall. So there would be no chance we'd get any funds. What the Senate has done is say, okay, just like last year, we think there might be some extra money in fiscal 25, so we're going to make some contingent appropriations. They did a whole big list last year, smaller list this year, but the waterfall would still be there in the event of additional funds. And that is sort of the, I'd welcome anything that, Colin, you're hearing. I know you've got a closer ear to some of this, but last I've heard that was the Senate's position, and I just don't know where the committee of conference is on this, or if they've taken it up. Colin, do you?
I don't have any additional update. I do know that the House leadership was made aware that the Senate position was what I will say at Vermont NEA. I don't want to speak for the treasurer's office, but we supported for all the reasons that Tim just articulated. Timeline wise, the legislature is looking to close the budget, if not today, tomorrow, I think is the latest. So we'll have clarity on this imminently.
And a side note on that, we track the 25 ADEC contributions, and that's usually a pretty easy process because we get the bulk of the ADEC contribution upfront. But there is this federal grant offset where positions funded by federal grants, the employee benefit piece of that comes to make up the last piece of the ADEC, basically. So stated otherwise, the state funds the ADEC up to, but it relies on what portion of federal grant funding would be expected with those positions.
Tim, do you want to just state the approximate scale of it?
So a couple $100 million for the ADEC, and we expect about $10 million from federal grants. So Jeremiah's team tracks that, and it is on a significant lag. So at this point, we are only just getting second quarter receipts, and they're lagging and coming in low. So we have approached, just yesterday, we approached the conference committee asking for because we do expect additional revenues in 25, asking for an additional appropriation to our office so that in the event those federal grants lag, we have. And I think we're talking a couple $1 million, not a ton. We asked for 6 because we expect next year a similar phenomenon may happen given everything at the federal level. I'm not sure if all of that will get in, but I think there's general consensus that this is an appropriate thing to do. I was talking to Commissioner Gresham earlier today. We're not going to miss the ADEC. So just wanted to let folks know that that is a late breaking issue that we're on top of, and we're going to move through the comments. Excellent. So that is, I think there's anything else that we have, fortunately, at the legislature. Questions? My clock and my computer said 4 o'clock exactly. It's just like, that's it. I mean, that's impressive.
That's impressive.
High five around the table. I'll buy everybody a cookie.
Oh, I already had it. Thank you.
Any questions? Any other business before the board?
Sure. I'm just really grateful for everyone to make it down today. It's so nice to see everybody in person.
This has been wonderful. And thank you for your staff and everyone putting out the spread for lunch. And that, I know that just doesn't magically appear.
Right.
And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to put that out. So that was very nice and truly appreciate it. We have a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
And we have a second. All those in favor of adjournment, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Oh, we are adjourned. Excellent,
And
excellent.
we start our drives.
That's right.
Oh, gosh, that's right. You guys have to.
To the drive.
I mean, I have